Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Frank Carpenter, and I've been a forest ranger for 28 years. I've seen bears tear apart campsites, watched lightning split 100-year-old trees in half, and pulled more lost hikers out of Alaska's wilderness than I care to count. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found at Devil's Creek Logging Camp in February of 1958. I was 2 weeks away from retirement when the call came in. 28 years of service, and all I wanted was to hang up my badge and forget about the war. The Pacific Theater had given me enough nightmares to last 3 lifetimes. I figured walking through quiet forests and helping lost tourists would wash the blood out of my dreams. Mostly, it worked. The radio crackled to life around noon on February 12th. Ranger Station 7, this is Bush Pilot Charlie 4. You copy? I set down my coffee and picked up the handset. This is Carpenter. Go ahead, Charlie 4. Frank, it's Tom Bailey. Just flew over. Devil's Creek camp on my supply run to Seward. Thought you should know there's smoke coming from those old buildings. That got my attention. Devil's Creek had been abandoned since 1932 when the whole logging crew vanished during a blizzard. 26 men gone without a trace. The Forest Service had written it off as an avalanche, but no bodies were ever found. The buildings were still standing, but nobody went there anymore. Too remote, too many bad stories. You sure about the smoke, Tom? Positive. Fresh smoke from at least 3 chimneys. And Frank, I could swear I saw someone moving around down there. I stared at the map on my wall. Devil's Creek was 200 miles from Anchorage, accessible only by snowshoe or dog sled in winter. If someone was squatting in those buildings, they'd picked one hell of a place to hide. Any idea how they got in there? No vehicle tracks I could see. But the snow's been falling heavy the past week, could have covered them. Up. After Tom signed off, I sat back in my chair and rubbed the scars on my left hand, where the shrapnel had taken 2 fingers. 26 years since Guadalcanal, and I could still feel phantom pain in those missing digits when a storm was coming. The smart thing would be to wait for spring. Let whoever was camping in the old buildings freeze or starve if they were too stupid to come out. But regulations were regulations, and I'd never filed an incomplete report in 28 years. I wasn't about to start with 2 weeks left on the job. I packed my gear that afternoon, my .30-30 Winchester, compass, emergency radio, and enough food for 3 days. The temperature was dropping fast, -30 and falling. I'd survived worse in the Philippines, but at least there I'd had my squad watching my back. The snowshoe trek took me most of the next day. The forest was eerily quiet. Usually you'd hear something: birds, squirrels, even wind through the trees. But the deeper I went into Devil's Creek territory, the more the silence pressed in around me like a living thing. I made camp 5 miles out and tried to raise the ranger station on my radio. Nothing but static and what sounded like distant music. Big band music, like the kind we used to hear on Armed Forces radio. That was strange. The emergency frequency should have been clear. The next morning, I climbed the ridge overlooking Devil's Creek camp. Tom had been right about the smoke. 3 buildings had thin gray streams rising from their chimneys. But something else caught my eye: footprints in the snow between the buildings. Not random tracks like you'd expect from people living there. These prints formed perfect circles around each building, like someone had walked the same path over and over again. I counted 15 structures total: bunkhouses, a mess hall, equipment sheds, and the main office building, all exactly as they'd been left in 1932, just weathered and gray. But those 3, with the smoking chimneys, looked almost maintained. Fresh chinked logs, cleared snow from the roofs. Through my binoculars, I watched the buildings for 2 hours. No movement, no sounds. Just the smoke rising straight up in the still air. I was probably looking at harmless vagrants who'd found shelter for the winter. During the Depression, plenty of men had disappeared into the Alaska wilderness rather than stand in breadlines. Some of them were probably still out there, living like hermits, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the war talking that sixth sense, that kept you alive when snipers were drawing beads on your position. The forest around Devil's Creek felt like a held breath, like the whole wilderness was waiting for something terrible to happen. I checked my rifle and started down the ridge. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me halfway down the slope, a sweet, rotten odor that reminded me of the field hospitals in the Pacific. But underneath that was something worse. Something that made my war-trained nose wrinkle with recognition. I'd smelled it before, on Guadalcanal, when we'd found what was left of Henderson's patrol after the Japanese had been at them for 3 days. It was the smell of meat that had been prepared. The footprints in the snow were even stranger up close. They formed perfect circles around each building, worn deep into the snow like someone had walked the same path thousands of times. But here's what made my skin crawl. All the prints were the same size, same boot, same gait, same depth. Like one person had made every single track. I approached the mess hall first, the largest building with smoke coming from its chimney. The windows were too dirty to see through, but there was definitely someone inside. I could hear movement, footsteps, scraping sounds, and something else, something that sounded like chewing. I knocked on the door. Forest Service. Anyone in there? The sound stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door, heavy boots on wooden floors. The footsteps stopped right on the other side of the door. "We're hungry," came a voice from inside. Male, but strangely hollow. "So very hungry. I'm Ranger Carpenter. You folks need any help? It's 30 below out here." Another long pause. Then the voice again. But this time, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It wasn't one voice, it was several voices, speaking the exact same words at the exact same time. "We've been hungry for so long." I backed away from the door and circled around to try the windows. The glass was filthy, but I could make out shapes moving inside. People, but they moved wrong. Too stiff, too coordinated, like they were all marching to the same drumbeat. Through a crack in the boards, I saw them, 6 men in loggers' clothing, sitting around a wooden table. At first glance, they looked normal, just skinny guys sharing a meal. But when I looked closer, my stomach turned over. They were impossibly thin, not just malnourished, skeletal. Their clothes hung on them like scarecrows, but their stomachs bulged out like they'd swallowed basketballs. And they were eating, constantly eating, their hands moving up to their mouths in perfect synchronization, but there was nothing on the table. They were going through the motions of eating, but their hands were empty, pantomiming a feast while their sunken eyes stared at nothing, and they never stopped. Hand to mouth, like machines that couldn't shut off, I pulled out my radio. Static and that same big band music, louder now. Through the static, I thought I heard voices talking about timber yields and production quotas. Old voices, with 1,930 seconds accents. One of the men inside turned toward the window. I got a good look at his face and nearly dropped my radio. He was old. Not just old, ancient, wrinkled and weathered like he'd been left out in the elements for decades. But his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black like pools of tar. And he was smiling, a wide, impossible smile that showed too many teeth. I backed away from the building and headed for the next one with smoke. I had to know what I was dealing with before I could radio for help. The Forest Service would want details, evidence. They'd want to know if these men were dangerous or just crazy. The second building was a bunkhouse. Same smell, same circular footprints in the snow. Through the window, I saw more men. Same impossible thinness, same bulging stomachs, same synchronized eating motions. But these men were wearing different clothes, decades of different clothes, like they'd been adding to their group over the years. I counted 8 this time. The youngest looked like he might have been in his 20s, but his hair was completely white. The oldest. God, the oldest looked like a mummy. Dried skin stretched over bone, but still moving, still going through those eating motions. In the corner of the room, I saw something that made me reach for my rifle. Bones. Human bones, gnawed clean and stacked in neat piles. Arm bones, leg bones, ribs, and skulls, too many skulls for the number of men I could see. I was looking at cannibals, but not ordinary cannibals. These men had been eating people for decades, and somehow they were still alive, still hungry. The radio crackled to life. Through the static came a voice I recognized: Tom Bailey, the pilot who'd spotted the smoke. Frank? Frank, are you there? Something's wrong with my radio. I keep hearing these voices. I grabbed the handset. Tom, this is Frank. Where are you? Flying back from Seward. But Frank, listen, I flew over Devil's Creek again, and I saw something. There are people outside now. Lots of people. They're all walking in circles around the buildings. I looked around the camp. I didn't see anyone outside. Tom, I'm at the camp right now. There's nobody. Then I saw them. They came out of the buildings all at once. Not just the 6 from the mess hall or the 8 from the bunkhouse. Dozens of them. All wearing the same hollow expression. All moving with that same wrong synchronization. And they were all walking toward me. 26 men. I counted them as they emerged from the various buildings, and the number matched exactly with the logging crew that had vanished in 1932. But these weren't the same men, couldn't be. Some of them looked like they'd been dead for years, mummified by the cold and preserved by something I didn't want to think about. They arranged themselves in a perfect circle around me, about 50 feet out. Just stood there, swaying slightly, their black eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was definitely not human. I raised my rifle. Stay back, Forest Service. They all smiled at the same time, 26 identical grins, showing far too many teeth. We remember you, they said in unison. Not 26 different voices, one voice coming from 26 mouths. You smell like the war, like the hunger you've tasted. My blood turned to ice water. They were talking about Guadalcanal, about the things I'd tried to forget with 28 years of whiskey and quiet forests. You know what it's like. The voice continued from all their mouths. To be so hungry you'll eat anything, to cross that line and never come back. I'd never told anyone about Ramirez, about how he'd lasted 6 days after the shrapnel took out most of his guts, about what we'd had to do when the rations ran out and the medics couldn't get through Japanese lines. We can smell it on you. The guilt, the hunger you carry. You understand us. They started walking closer, still in perfect formation. I aimed at the nearest one and pulled the trigger. The bullet took him center mass, spun him around, dropped him in the snow. But the others didn't react at all. They kept walking, kept smiling, and then the one I'd shot stood back up. There was a hole in his chest big enough to put my fist through. I could see daylight through the other side, but he brushed snow off his jacket and rejoined the circle like nothing had happened. We've been waiting for someone like you, they said. Someone who understands, someone who's crossed the line. I backed toward the tree line, working the bolt on my rifle. What are you? We are what hunger becomes when it never stops. We are what men become when they feast on flesh and find they can never be satisfied. The one in the lead, a big man in a supervisor's jacket, stepped forward. His face was barely human anymore, just skin stretched over skull, but when he spoke, his voice was different from the others, clearer, more individual. My name was Carter Willis. I was the foreman here in 1932. We got snowed in during the worst blizzard in 50 years. Food ran out after the first week. The others gathered closer around him, like children around a storyteller. We drew lots, Willis continued. Fair and square. Peterson drew the short straw. We told ourselves it was just survival, just staying alive until the snow melted. I'd heard this story before. Different war, different men, but the same desperate choices. But after we ate Peterson, we were still hungry. Hungrier than before. And there was Morrison, poor Morrison with his broken leg. He couldn't run. The circle tightened. I could smell them now, that sweet rot mixed with something worse, something that had been eating and eating for decades without ever feeling full. Each man we ate made us hungrier. And when the snow finally melted and the rescue teams came, well, we were the only ones left, the only ones they found. The report said, you all died in the Fife blizzard. Willis's ruined face smiled. We did die. But we kept eating. And when you cross that line, when you develop a taste for human flesh, death doesn't matter anymore. Hunger becomes all you are. I tried to run then, turned and sprinted for the forest, crashing through snow up to my knees. But they were faster than they looked. They spread out through the trees like they'd done this before, cutting off every escape route. I made it maybe 100 yards before they surrounded me again. Don't fight it, Willis said, stepping out from behind a massive spruce. You know what it's like, the hunger that never goes away. Join us, and you'll never have to feel guilty again. I'm not like you. No? Then why haven't you eaten a full meal in 28 years? Why do you pour whiskey on your food so you can't taste it properly? Why do you live alone in the forest, afraid of what you might do if you get too close to people? They were inside my head somehow, reading memories I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself they weren't real. Ramirez lasted 6 days, Willis continued. 6 days of screaming while the infection ate him alive. But you couldn't let him die, could you? Couldn't waste the meat. Stop. You cut off his leg while he was still breathing. Told him it was to save his life, but you were already planning the soup you'd make from the bone marrow. Stop. I emptied my rifle into Willis. 6 shots, center mass. He staggered backward, black blood spraying from the wounds, but kept talking. That's why you became a ranger, why you chose the loneliest job you could find. You were afraid of the hunger, afraid you might develop a taste for it again. The other 25 moved closer. I could see my reflection in their black eyes, a scared old man who'd been running from his demons for 3 decades. Join us, they whispered in unison. Let the hunger out. Stop fighting what you are. I looked around the circle of ruined faces. Some were so decomposed I could see bone through the rotted flesh. Others looked almost fresh, like they'd joined the group recently. All of them had the same expression, a terrible joy, like they'd found something they'd been searching for their whole lives. And for a moment, God help me, I was tempted. The guilt had been eating me alive for 28 years. The dreams, the flashbacks, the way I couldn't look at raw meat without seeing Ramirez's face. Maybe it would be easier to just give in, to let the hunger take over and stop fighting it. But then I remembered why I'd become a ranger in the first place. Not to hide from what I'd done, but to make up for it. 28 years of helping people, of saving lives, of doing good in the world. I reached into my pack and pulled out my emergency flares. No, I said, popping the first one. I may have crossed the line once, but I'm not like you. I learned to live with what I did. You just kept feeding it. The bright red light made them hiss and back away. Their faces looked even more horrible in the flare's glow, melted and twisted like candle wax. I lit 2 more flares and threw them at the nearest buildings. You want to know the difference between us? I shouted over their screams. I stopped. The flares caught the old wooden buildings faster than I'd expected. Dry timber and decades of neglect made perfect kindling. Within minutes, the mess hall was fully engulfed, and the fire was spreading to the other structures. The 26 creatures, I couldn't think of them as men anymore, stood transfixed by the flames. Their black eyes reflected the orange light like mirrors, and for the first time since I'd met them, they looked afraid. You don't understand, Willis said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. We can't die. The hunger won't let us. Maybe not, I said, lighting another flare, but I can make sure you can't spread it either. I threw the flare at the nearest bunkhouse and watched it catch. The creatures moved away from the flames but didn't flee. They seemed drawn to the fire even as it terrified them. That's when I understood. The hunger had kept them alive for 26 years, but it had also trapped them here. They couldn't leave Devil's Creek because this was where it had started, where they'd first crossed the line from survival to something darker. The forest, Willis whispered. If the fire spreads to the forest. He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. The hunger would spread with the flames. Every creature that died in the fire, every person who came to investigate, they'd all become part of it. The hunger would grow until it consumed everything. I looked at the wind direction, northeast, toward the main forest. If the fire jumped to the trees, it would take out thousands of acres, and everything it touched would become infected with whatever had turned these men into monsters. There's a way to stop it, Willis said, reading my thoughts again. But you won't like it. Tell me. The hunger needs flesh to survive. Living flesh, if there's no food source. I understood immediately. The creatures would starve without people to eat. But as long as they remained alive or whatever they were, they'd always be a threat. Always be waiting for the next lost hiker or stranded pilot. How many people have you killed over the years? Dozens. Hunters, prospectors, anyone unlucky enough to find this place. We'd take them one at a time, make them last. But it's never enough. The hunger always comes back. The fire was spreading faster now. 2 more buildings had caught, and the heat was becoming unbearable. But the creatures still hadn't moved. They stood in their perfect circle, watching me with those horrible black eyes. "What happens if I leave?" I asked. "We follow. The hunger follows. It's tasted, you now smelled your guilt. It knows what you are." I thought about Tom Bailey, circling overhead in his plane. About the rescue teams that would come looking for me when I didn't report in. About every innocent person who might stumble across this place in the years to come. 28 years of trying to make up for what I'd done on Guadalcanal. 28 years of good work, of lives saved and people helped. But it would all be meaningless if I let this hunger loose in the world. I pulled out my last 3 flares and my emergency fuel canister. Military grade, designed to burn hot enough to melt steel. I'd been saving it for emergencies, but this qualified. "What are you doing?" Willis asked, but I could see in his ruined face that he already knew. "Finishing what I started 28 years ago." I doused myself with the fuel. It was cold against my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was Ramirez's face as I'd cut into his leg. The way he'd looked at me, not with horror, but with understanding. Like he knew what I had to do and forgave me for it. "You can't," Willis said. "The guilt you carry, we can take that away. You'll never have to remember what you did." "The guilt is what makes me human," I said, striking a match. "Without it, I'd be just like you." The fire caught immediately. I had maybe 10 seconds before the pain became unbearable, but that would be enough. The fuel canister would explode, taking out everything in a 50-foot radius. The creatures, the buildings, and the hunger itself. Willis and the others rushed toward me, but the flames drove them back. They screamed not in pain, but in fury. The hunger was losing its hold on the world, and it knew it. As the fire consumed me, I thought I saw Ramirez standing at the edge of the flames. Not the dying, infected version from my nightmares, but the young soldier I'd known before the war broke us both. He was smiling, and in his eyes, I saw something I'd been searching for my whole life. Forgiveness. The explosion took out the entire camp and everything in it. The official Forest Service report lists the Devil's Creek incident as an accidental fire caused by faulty equipment in an abandoned logging camp. Ranger Frank Carpenter died in the line of duty while investigating unauthorized occupation of federal land. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for 28 years of exemplary service. The fire burned for 3 days before winter weather finally contained it. Search teams found Carpenter's remains near the center of the blaze, along with evidence that he'd used emergency flares to prevent the fire from spreading to the surrounding forest. His actions saved thousands of acres of wilderness. The area was permanently closed to civilian access due to unstable soil conditions following the fire. Official surveys confirmed that the ground had been so thoroughly burned that nothing would grow there for decades. What the surveys didn't mention was that the soil itself seemed wrong, somehow too dark, too rich, like it had been fertilized with something other than ash. Tom Bailey, the bush pilot who'd first spotted smoke at the camp, reported radio interference in the area for months after the fire. Emergency frequencies would pick up fragments of old conversations, big band music, and sometimes what sounded like chewing. The Forest Service blamed atmospheric disturbances caused by the burned landscape. Bailey stopped flying over Devil's Creek after his radio picked up a transmission that sounded like Frank Carpenter's voice saying, "The hunger is contained. Do not come here." No human remains other than Carpenter's were ever found at the site. The Forest Service assumed that any squatters had fled before the fire reached them. They never explained the bone fragments that search teams discovered throughout the burned area, fragments that carbon dating suggested were decades old. Local indigenous elders, when asked about the area, would only say that some hungers should never be fed and some places should never be disturbed. They'd known about Devil's Creek long before the loggers arrived in 1932. They'd known what lived there. The camp was never rebuilt. Maps showed the area as uninhabitable wilderness, too remote and dangerous for development. Occasionally, hunters or hikers would report strange sounds coming from the burned forest, rhythmic footsteps, chewing noises, voices calling for help. These reports were dismissed as wind through damaged trees and the psychological effects of isolation. But every February 12th, on the anniversary of the fire, Tom Bailey's radio would crackle to life with a brief transmission. "Anchorage Base, Carpenter here. The hunger is contained. The message always came at exactly noon, and it always lasted for 30 seconds, long enough to confirm that somewhere in the burned wasteland of Devil's Creek, Frank Carpenter was still on duty, still making sure that some hungers stayed buried, still paying for sins that should have been forgiven long ago. The Forest Service keeps the area under surveillance, though they'd never admit it. Motion sensors, disguised as weather equipment, monitor the burned zone for any signs of movement. Satellite imagery is reviewed monthly for changes in the landscape. So far, nothing has grown back. The soil remains dark and rich, but seeds won't take root. Animals avoid the area entirely, as if they can sense something wrong with the ground itself. Sometimes, during winter storms, the monitoring equipment picks up heat signatures moving through the burned forest. Always the same pattern, figures walking in perfect circles around the location where the buildings once stood. The signatures appear for exactly 26 minutes, then vanish without explanation. The official position is equipment malfunction, caused by electromagnetic interference. But the technicians who review the recordings have noticed something troubling. Each year, the heat signatures seem a little stronger, a little more distinct, as if whatever Frank Carpenter contained in that fire is slowly working its way back to the surface. And every February 12th, when Tom Bailey's radio picks up that familiar transmission, the message is slightly different. Each year, it gets a little harder to understand. Each year, it sounds a little less like Frank Carpenter and a little more like something else, something hungry. But the area remains closed. The warnings remain in place. And somewhere in the darkness of the burned forest, a ranger continues his patrol, making sure that some doors stay locked forever. Even if keeping them closed costs him everything. Even if the hunger never truly dies. Even if, someday, 26 voices might start speaking as one again. My name is Margaret Rivers, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 29 years old, and I'm probably the youngest female park ranger in all of Alaska. 3 years ago, I came up here to the Brooks Range, to the most remote station in North America. People think I'm crazy for wanting this job, but they don't understand. Sometimes, you need to get as far away from everything as possible. The burns on my arms tell a story I don't like to talk about. House fire, 2 years back. I lost my 2 little ones. Emma was 5, Tommy was 3. The doctor said I was lucky to survive. I don't feel lucky. That's why I'm here. 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where the nearest person is a 4-day hike away. My job is simple enough. I watch the wildlife, count the animals, make sure the land stays protected. During summer, it's beautiful up here, all green and alive. But winter is different. Winter is when the sun goes away for 65 days straight, and you're alone with just your thoughts and the cold. This is my 3rd winter doing the solo assignment. Most rangers won't take it. They say the darkness gets to you, makes you see things that aren't there. But I like the quiet. The cabin is small but warm, with thick walls and a good heating system. I've got my radio, my rifle, enough food to last until spring. It's December now, and I'm on day 47 without sunlight. The temperature outside is minus 50 degrees. Inside, it's cozy. I keep detailed logs of everything: weather, animal tracks, equipment checks. It helps keep my mind busy. But lately, something's been different. It started small, little things that didn't quite make sense. Yesterday morning, I found handprints on the outside of my window. Small handprints, like a child's, pressed into the frost. That was strange, because no one else is supposed to be out here. The nearest Inupiat village is 200 miles south, and they know better than to travel in this weather. I told myself it was probably just ice, forming in weird patterns. Ice can look like anything if you stare at it long enough. Then this morning, I found them again. Fresh ones. Perfect little handprints, right at the height where a 5-year-old might reach. Like Emma used to do on car windows. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, and staring at those prints through the glass. The coffee was hot, but my hands were shaking anyway. Not from cold, from something else. Just ice? I said out loud, just to hear a voice, even if it was my own. Just weird ice patterns. But deep down, I knew ice didn't make handprints that perfect. I've been keeping these audio logs for the rangers who'll come in spring. If something happens to me, they'll need to know what went wrong. That's standard procedure. But really, I think I'm just talking to keep myself sane. The thing about being alone for this long is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. I know this. I've read all the studies about isolation and what it does to people. Hallucinations are normal. Hearing voices is normal. Seeing things that aren't there is normal. But those handprints look so real. Tonight, I'm going to clean them off the window and see if they come back. That'll prove it's just ice. Just patterns that form overnight in the frost. Then, I can stop thinking about them. I have to stop thinking about them. Because when I look at those small handprints, all I can think about is Emma and Tommy, and how they used to press their faces against windows when it snowed. How they'd write their names in the fog with their little fingers. And that's a road my mind can't go down. Not here. Not alone. Day 48. The handprints came back. I cleaned the window last night with hot water, scrubbed every inch of frost away. This morning, they were there again. 5 little handprints, perfectly spaced, like someone small had been trying to look inside. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what I found in the snow. Footprints. Small ones, leading right up to my cabin. Child-sized boots, maybe size 10 or 11. The prints come from the tree line, walk straight to my door, then just stop. Like whoever made them disappeared right at my doorstep. I followed the trail back to the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, showing me track after track in the snow. But about 50 yards from the cabin, they stopped. Just ended, like the person making them had vanished into thin air. I stood there in the cold, my breath making clouds in the beam of my flashlight, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the fire. Fear. Real, deep-down fear that makes your stomach twist up. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded tiny in all that empty space. "Is someone out there?" Nothing. Just whined through the trees. But I swear I heard something else. Something that made my blood go cold. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched laughter, like children playing. I ran back to the cabin and locked the door. Sat at my radio and tried to call for help, but all I got was static. The radio's been acting up lately. Instead of normal static, it makes these weird sounds. Almost like whispers or singing. I know what you're thinking if you ever hear these tapes. You're thinking I'm losing it, that the isolation is getting to me. Maybe you're right. Maybe those footprints are just snow drifts, and maybe that laughter was just wind through the trees. Maybe the handprints are ice, and maybe my radio is just broken. But I've been doing this job for 3 years. I know the difference between animal tracks and human tracks. I know what wind sounds like and what laughter sounds like. And those prints, they were fresh. Made sometime after the snow stopped falling around midnight. The temperature outside was minus 45 degrees last night. No child could survive 10 minutes in that cold, let alone walk 50 yards through deep snow to my cabin. So, either I'm going crazy or something impossible is happening out here. I spent the day checking my equipment, making sure everything was working right. The heating system is fine, the walls are solid, the door lock's tight, my rifle is loaded and ready. But none of that makes me feel better. Because how do you fight something that leaves footprints but no trail back? As evening came on, I started hearing new sounds. Tapping on the walls, soft and rhythmic, like someone knocking, but not quite, more like fingers drumming against wood. I went outside with my rifle and my flashlight. Walked all around the cabin, checking every inch. No footprints in the snow. No sign that anyone had been there. But the tapping continued from inside. When I came back in, it stopped. Now it's late, and I'm sitting here with all the lights on, writing this log. The cabin feels different tonight. Warmer somehow. Which doesn't make sense because I haven't touched the heat. The temperature gauge says it's 20 degrees warmer in here than it should be. And I keep hearing things. Soft sounds, like whispers in another language. Sometimes it sounds like singing, the kind of songs mothers sing to help children sleep. I found something else today, too. Drawings. They were stuck under my door when I woke up. 4 pieces of paper, covered in crayon drawings of stick figures. Adults and children holding hands. A house with smoke coming out of the chimney. A family sitting around a table. The paper was old and yellowed, like it had been buried in snow for years. The crayons were worn down to tiny stubs. And the drawings? They looked like the kind of pictures Emma and Tommy used to make. I should throw them away. I know I should, but I put them on my kitchen table instead, next to my coffee cup. They make the cabin feel less empty. That scares me more than the footprints, more than the laughter, because it means some part of me wants this to be real. Some part of me wants to believe that somewhere out there in the dark and cold, there are children who need help. And that's dangerous thinking when you're alone in the wilderness. Day 52. They're getting bolder. I can hear them outside every night now. Voices calling my name through the wind. Maggie, they say, soft and sweet. Maggie, we're cold. Maggie, can you help us? The voices sound young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Sometimes they speak English, sometimes something else. Inupiat, I think, though I only know a few words of the language. I've stopped going outside after dark. Whatever's out there, it wants me to come to it. And every bone in my body tells me that's a bad idea. The handprints on my window have multiplied. Now there are dozens of them, all over the glass. Small hands, pressed against the frost from outside. And when I look closely, I can see face prints too. Little noses and foreheads, like children pressing their faces against the glass to look in. The drawings keep appearing. Every morning, there are new ones slipped under my door. Pictures of families, of children playing in snow, of warm houses with smoke rising from chimneys. The paper is always old and brittle, like it's been frozen for years. But today, I found something different. A drawing that made my hands shake so hard I dropped it. It was a picture of our house, my old house, where Emma and Tommy died, drawn in careful crayon lines, with stick figures of a mother and 2 children standing in front. At the top, in shaky letters, someone had written, Maggie's family. No one up here knows about my children. No one knows about the fire. I never told anyone. So how could this drawing exist? I did some research on my radio. During the brief times it works normally. Asked the dispatcher in Fairbanks about the history of this area. What she told me made my blood run cold. In 1847, there was an Inupiat village, about 10 miles from here. During one of the worst winters on record, the adults had to travel far to find food. They left the children in the village, thinking they'd be back in a few days. A blizzard came. Lasted 3 weeks. When the hunters finally made it back, they found the village buried in snow. All the children had frozen to death, huddled together in the largest building, trying to stay warm. The village was never rebuilt. The Inupiat say the area is cursed, that the spirits of those children still wander the land, looking for warmth and comfort they'll never find. I told the dispatcher I was asking for a research project. But really, I needed to know what I might be dealing with. The temperature inside my cabin keeps rising. It's now 40 degrees warmer than it should be, and I haven't touched the thermostat. The heat is so strong that ice has started melting off the inside walls. Water drips constantly from the ceiling. But here's the thing that really scares me. The heat feels good. After months of bitter cold, this warmth feels like a hug. It feels like coming home. And I think that's the point. Last night, I heard children singing outside, the same lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, and that I used to sing to Emma and Tommy. But they were singing it in Inupiat, in voices that sounded far away and sad. I opened the door just a crack to listen better. The singing stopped immediately, but I could feel them out there, watching, waiting. I know you're there, I said into the darkness. What do you want? For a long moment, nothing. Then, so quiet I almost missed it. We're cold, Maggie. We're so cold. I slammed the door shut and locked it. But part of me, the part that still aches for my lost children, wanted to open it again. Wanted to call them inside where it's warm. That's what they want. I understand that now. They don't want to hurt me. They want what I want. Comfort, warmth, family. They want someone to take care of them, to sing them to, sleep, to make them feel safe. And God help me, I want to give them that. I keep thinking about Emma and Tommy, about how scared they must have been during the fire, how they called for me, and I couldn't get to them in time, how they died cold and afraid while I was trapped in another room, screaming their names. These children outside, these spirits or whatever they are, they're just like my babies were in those final moments, cold and scared and needing their mother. I've started leaving food outside, just small portions, crackers, soup, warm milk in a thermos. It's always gone by morning. I tell myself it's probably animals, but I know better. Animals don't arrange the empty containers in perfect little rows. Animals don't leave thank you notes written in crayon. The radio is getting worse. Now it only picks up children's voices, singing songs I've never heard. Beautiful, haunting melodies that make me cry without understanding why. I should be scared. I know I should be. But instead, I feel something I haven't felt since the fire. I feel needed. Day 56. I saw them tonight. Not shadows or glimpses or tricks of light. I saw them clearly, standing in the snow outside my window. 5 children, maybe 6 years old, wearing old-fashioned winter clothes that were torn and faded. Their skin was pale blue-white, like they'd been in the cold too long. But their eyes were bright and alive and looking right at me. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. I opened the door and stepped outside in my bare feet. The cold bit at my skin, but I didn't care. These children needed help. "Are you okay?" I asked them. "Are you hurt?" The oldest one, a little girl with long dark hair, stepped forward. When she spoke, I could see her breath in the air, but her voice sounded like it was coming from far away. "We've been waiting for you, Maggie," she said. "We've been waiting so long." "Waiting for me? Why?" "Because you understand," said a little boy beside her. "You lost your children too. You know what it feels like." My heart stopped. "How do you know about my children?" "We know about loss," the girl said. "We know about cold. We know about being afraid and alone." They stepped closer, and I could see them more clearly. Their clothes were from another time, long coats and thick boots that looked handmade. Inupiat children, just like the ones who died in the blizzard more than a century ago. "You're the children from the village," I whispered. "We've been here ever since," the girl said, waiting in the cold. Waiting for someone who would understand. "What do you want from me?" "We want to be warm," she said, and her voice broke like she was about to cry. "We've been cold for so long, Maggie, so very long." I felt tears freezing on my cheeks. These poor babies, trapped here for over 100 years, never able to rest, never able to find peace. "How can I help you?" I asked. The children looked at each other, then back at me. "Let us come inside," the girl said. "Let us be warm with you." I should have said no. Some part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to lock the door, to call for help. But looking at these children, 7 days, these lost, frightened children, all I could think about was Emma and Tommy. How they must have felt in their last moments, how much they must have needed me. "Of course," I said. "Come inside where it's warm." They smiled then, and their smiles were heartbreaking and grateful and something else, something that made my skin crawl even as my heart broke for them. They followed me into the cabin, and immediately the temperature began to rise even more. The heat was overwhelming now, making me dizzy and weak. "Is this better?" I asked them. "It's wonderful," the girl said. "But we need more warmth, Maggie. We need the kind of warmth that comes from inside." She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was ice cold, but where she touched me, I felt a strange pulling sensation, like something important was being drawn out of me. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Taking what we need," she said sadly. "We don't want to hurt you, Maggie, but we've been cold for so long." The other children gathered around me, placing their small hands on my arms, my shoulders, my face. Everywhere they touched, I felt that pulling sensation, the warmth leaving my body, flowing into theirs. I understood then what was happening. These children weren't just cold, they were empty, hollowed out by death and time and endless winter. They needed heat, needed life force, needed the very essence that kept me alive, and they were taking it from me. "Stop," I whispered, but my voice was getting weaker. "Please stop." "We can't," the little boy said, and he sounded genuinely sorry. "We need it too much. But don't be scared, Maggie. When it's over, you'll be with your children again. Emma and Tommy are waiting for you." At the mention of their names, I felt a surge of something, not fear, but peace. Because these children were right. I had lost everything that mattered to me. My babies were gone, and I was just marking time until I could be with them again. Maybe this was how it was supposed to happen. I closed my eyes and felt the warmth flowing out of me. The children's hands were getting warmer as mine got colder. Their skin was returning to a healthy pink as mine turned pale. "Thank you," the girl whispered. "Thank you for understanding." But as I felt my life slipping away, I had one last moment of clarity. These children had been taking warmth from travelers for over a century. They would never be satisfied, never be truly warm, never find peace. They would just keep taking and taking from anyone who was foolish enough to help them. But I was too weak to fight now, too tired to resist. "It's okay," I told them, thinking of Emma and Tommy. "It's okay." The last thing I remembered was the sound of children singing, soft and sweet, as the world went dark around me. From the official report filed by Ranger Station Supervisor James Mitchell, the 15th of February 1968, Ranger Margaret Rivers was found deceased in her cabin on February 12th, after failing to respond to radio contact for 3 weeks. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia, resulting from heating system failure during extreme weather conditions. The cabin was found in unusual condition. Despite outside temperatures of -60 degrees, the interior was warm enough that most of the ice on the walls had melted, causing significant water damage. However, Ranger Rivers was found frozen solid in her chair, wearing only light clothing. Personal effects recovered from the scene included standard Ranger equipment, food supplies sufficient for several more weeks, and numerous crayon drawings of unknown origin. These drawings appeared to be very old, though how they came to be in the cabin is unclear. Of particular note were the audio logs recovered from the scene. While the first several days of recordings appear normal, subsequent entries describe increasingly erratic behavior and apparent hallucinations consistent with extreme isolation syndrome. The final entries, recorded shortly before Ranger Rivers' death, contain lengthy conversations with parties not present at the scene. Asterisk. Personal note. Handwritten on the back of the official report. Asterisk. I've been a ranger for 26 years, and I've seen what isolation can do to people. But I've never seen anything like this. Maggie's body wasn't just frozen, it was drained. Like something had pulled every bit of warmth and life out of her. The medical examiner said he'd never seen anything like it. And those drawings, they weren't made by any living child. The paper was older than Maggie herself, and the crayons were worn down to nothing. But the pictures were fresh, like they'd been drawn yesterday. We found handprints all over the outside of the cabin. Small ones, like children, had been pressing their hands against the windows. They were burned into the frost so deep that it took 3 days of warm weather to melt them away. The Inupiat elders I spoke to just shook their heads when I described what we found. "Bad place," one of them told me. "Children who never left, still looking for warmth. I've recommended that the station be permanently closed. The official reason is equipment unreliability and harsh conditions. But the truth is, I don't want to send another ranger up there alone. Since Maggie's death, 3 other isolated stations have reported similar phenomena. Children's voices on the radio, handprints on windows, rangers talking to people who aren't there. Whatever happened to Maggie is spreading. Or maybe it was always there, and we just never noticed because no one survived long enough to tell the story. Either way, I'm putting in for retirement next month. Some things you see in this job, you can explain away. Others follow you home and whisper at your windows when you're trying to sleep. The night after we found Maggie's body, I went home to my family. Hugged my kids a little tighter, made sure their rooms were warm enough. Because I keep thinking about those drawings, about children who died cold and afraid more than a century ago. And I wonder if warmth is something you can really give to the dead, or if they just keep taking it from the living, one person at a time, forever. Asterisk. Final entry found in Ranger Rivers' personal journal. Asterisk. They're not gone. I thought when I died, they would be satisfied, would finally be warm enough to rest. But they're still here, still cold, still searching. I understand now. The dead don't need warmth, they need life. And no matter how much they take, it's never enough. Because you can't fill an empty space with something borrowed. It just flows. Right through. But I'm with Emma and Tommy now. That part is real. That part is warm. If you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, and you hear children calling your name in the dark, don't answer. Don't open your door. Don't try to help. Some kinds of cold can never be warmed. Some kinds of lost can never be found. And some kinds of love, Some kinds of love will destroy you, one small piece at a time, until there's nothing left but the echo of children singing lullabies in the endless night. My name is Daniel Wolfhart, and I've been a park ranger in Denali for 12 years. People always smile when they hear my last name. They think it's perfect for someone who studies wolves. What they don't know is that my grandfather changed it from Wolfert when he came from Germany. Sometimes I wonder if that old name might have been better. Maybe then I wouldn't have felt so connected to these animals. Maybe then I wouldn't have pushed so hard to understand them. October 1974 was supposed to be my last month studying the Wonder Lake wolf pack. I'd been tracking them for 3 years, documenting their hunting patterns and social structure. The research was going well, too well, maybe. I was getting close to something important about pack behavior, something that might change how we understood wolves completely. The morning everything started, I was sitting in my research cabin, writing notes about yesterday's observations. The pack had been acting strange lately. Usually, they hunted in the early morning and evening. But for the past week, I'd seen them moving during the day, staying close together like they were planning something. My partner, Dr. Sarah Martinez, was supposed to meet me that morning. She'd been studying the pack's communication patterns from her camp 5 miles north. Sarah was the smart one, had her PhD in animal behavior from Berkeley. I was just a guy who'd learned to track in the army and fell in love with these wild places. When she didn't show up by noon, I started to worry. Sarah was never late. Never. I tried raising her on the radio, but got nothing back except static. The weather was turning bad. October in Alaska can go from beautiful to deadly in hours, and the sky had that heavy gray look that meant snow was coming. The wind was picking up, making the cabin creak and groan. I'd seen storms trap people for days out here. I decided to hike to Sarah's camp. It wasn't far, maybe 2 hours through the tundra. I packed my rifle, extra ammunition, emergency supplies, and my tracking gear. After 12 years in these woods, I could find my way in a blizzard if I had to. The walk started normal enough. I knew every rock and tree between my cabin and hers. But something felt wrong. The usual sounds were missing. No birds. No small animals rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed too quiet. About halfway there, I found the first sign that something was very wrong. Wolf tracks. But not normal ones. These tracks showed the pack moving in a perfect line, like soldiers on patrol. Wolves usually spread out when they travel, checking different scents and paths. This looked like they were following orders. I'd studied thousands of wolf tracks over the years. These animals were smart, but they were still animals. They followed instincts, not battle plans. What I was seeing in the mud didn't make sense. The tracks led toward Sarah's camp. I started walking faster, my heart beating harder with each step. The rifle felt good in my hands. I'd used it to scare off bears and put down injured animals, never to protect myself from wolves. In 12 years, I'd never felt threatened by a wolf pack. They avoided humans. That was what made them survivors. When I reached the ridge above Sarah's camp, I stopped and looked down through my binoculars. Her tent was still standing, but something was wrong with the campsite. Equipment was scattered around, but not like a bear had gotten into it. Everything was arranged in patterns, neat piles, straight lines. Wolves don't arrange things. Bears don't either. I called out her name. No answer. Just the wind and the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Going down to Sarah's camp was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My gut was telling me to turn around and hike back to my cabin, but Sarah was my partner, and maybe she was hurt and needed help. The scene at her camp made my stomach turn. Sarah's sleeping bag was ripped open, covered in blood, but there was no body. Her clothes were scattered around the fire pit, torn but placed in a circle like some kind of ceremony. Her research notes were missing, but her equipment was still there. A bear would have destroyed everything looking for food. A wolf pack would have just taken what smelled interesting and left the rest alone. This looked like someone had been looking for something specific. I found her radio smashed against a tree. The pieces were arranged in a straight line, like they'd been placed there on purpose. Then I found the tracks. Wolf prints surrounded the entire camp, but they weren't scattered like you'd expect from a pack investigating new smells. They formed a perfect circle around where Sarah's tent had been, like they'd surrounded her, like they'd planned it. I'd studied wolf hunting behavior for years. They used teamwork, sure, but it was instinct. Pack animals working together to bring down prey. This looked different. This looked like strategy. I started following the trail, leading away from camp. The tracks showed at least 8 wolves, maybe more. They were heading north, deeper into the park, away from the roads and cabins. 3 miles from Sarah's camp, I found her body. I've seen death before, in the army and from animal attacks out here. But nothing had prepared me for what I found in that clearing. Sarah was lying in the center of a perfect circle of stones. Her arms were positioned straight at her sides. Her eyes were closed, like she was sleeping. But her throat had been torn out, and there were bite marks all over her body. The stones in the circle weren't random rocks. They were all the same size, all placed exactly the same distance apart. It would have taken hours to arrange them like that. Animals don't build monuments. I checked my rifle and started backing away from the clearing. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But I forced myself to think like a scientist, like Sarah would have wanted. Maybe this was some kind of territorial display. Maybe there was a rogue wolf, kicked out of its pack, going crazy from isolation. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't really there because I was scared and alone. Then I heard the howling. It started from one direction, then answered from another. Then another. They were surrounding me, just like they'd surrounded Sarah's camp. But this wasn't normal wolf communication. The howls had a rhythm to them, like a code, like they were talking to each other, coordinating their movements. I'd heard thousands of wolf vocalizations over the years. They howled to find each other, to claim territory, to celebrate a hunt. This was different. This sounded like language. My radio crackled to life. "Base to Wolfheart, come in." I grabbed it, grateful to hear a human voice. "Wolfheart, here. I need immediate backup at coordinates." I stopped, the voice on. The radio wasn't coming from park headquarters. It was coming from the woods around me. And it was howling. The radio was picking up the wolf pack's vocalizations and somehow translating them into human speech patterns. That was impossible. Radios don't work that way. I switched the radio off and started running. The howling followed me for miles. Sometimes it was close, sometimes far away, but it never stopped completely. They were tracking me, staying just out of sight but letting me know they were there. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the door, loaded my rifle, and tried to think rationally about what I'd seen. Sarah was dead. That was real. The stone circle was real. The coordinated tracks were real. Everything else had to have an explanation. Wolves were smart animals, but they were animals. They didn't plan murders or build monuments or speak through radio equipment. I tried calling park headquarters on the emergency radio, but I only got static. The storm was getting worse, and the mountains blocked a lot of signals anyway. I'd have to wait until morning to get help. I made dinner and tried to review my notes, looking for any signs that the pack had been acting unusually aggressive. But I kept thinking about those perfectly arranged stones and the way the tracks formed circles and lines instead of the random patterns wolves usually made. Around midnight, I heard scratching at the cabin door. At first I thought it was just the wind blowing branches against the wood, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful, like something was trying to get my attention. I picked up my rifle and looked out the window. 8 pairs of eyes stared back at me from the darkness. The wolves had found my cabin. The pack stayed outside my cabin all night. I could see their eyes reflecting the light from my lantern. 8 bright spots in the darkness that never seemed to blink. They didn't howl or try to break in. They just watched. I'd never heard of wolves doing that before. They usually avoided human buildings, especially ones that smelled like people and cooking food. These wolves were acting like they were studying me, learning my habits. When morning came, they were gone, but they'd left something behind. The area around my cabin was covered in tracks, but not random ones. The wolves had walked in perfect geometric patterns, triangles, squares, even what looked like letters. It was like they'd spent the night writing messages in the dirt. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards before they disappeared into the rocky ground near the river. But I found something else that made my hands shake. My missing equipment was arranged in a neat pile next to a large boulder. Items that had been scattered around different campsites over the past few weeks. Things I'd thought I'd just misplaced or lost. Someone, or something, had been collecting my gear, and now they were giving it back. I spent the day hiking to different areas where I'd seen the pack before, looking for more signs of their unusual behavior. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about wolves. At the old den site near Wonder Lake, I discovered bones arranged in patterns. Not just random animal remains, but carefully placed displays that looked almost like words, like the wolves were trying to communicate something. I took pictures and made detailed sketches. Dr. Martinez would have been fascinated by this. Sarah had always said that wolves were more intelligent than most people realized. But even she had never suggested they might be capable of symbolic thinking. That afternoon, while I was examining tracks near the lake, I heard engines approaching. A Park Service helicopter was landing in the clearing near my cabin. Help had finally arrived. I ran back through the woods, happy to see other human beings after 2 days alone with increasingly strange wolf behavior. But when I got to the cabin, my relief turned to confusion. There were 3 men in Park Service uniforms, but I didn't recognize any of them. And they weren't carrying the usual equipment for a search and rescue operation. Instead, they had military-style gear, automatic weapons, night vision equipment, and radio gear I'd never seen before. Mr. Wolfhart? The leader was a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes. I'm Agent Harrison from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We understand you've had some problems with an aggressive wolf pack. Something about his tone bothered me. I'd called for backup, but I hadn't mentioned anything about aggressive wolves. Just that Dr. Martinez was missing, and I'd found her body. How did you know about the wolves? I asked. We've been tracking this pack for several weeks, Harrison said. They've been involved in several incidents. We're here to resolve the situation. He asked me to show them where I'd found Sarah's body and to describe everything I'd observed about the pack's behavior. As I talked, the 3 men exchanged looks that made me uncomfortable, like they knew more than they were telling me. When we reached the clearing where Sarah had died, it was empty. The stone circle was gone. The body was gone. Even the bloodstains had somehow been cleaned away. Are you sure this is the right place? Harrison asked. I stared at the empty ground, trying to understand what had happened. I'd marked the location carefully. This was definitely the spot. But there was no evidence that anything had ever happened here. Someone moved the body, I said, and cleaned up the scene. Or maybe you were confused, one of the other agents suggested. Stress can make people see things that aren't really there. They were treating me like I was crazy. Like I'd imagined finding my partner's mutilated corpse in a circle of stones. We hiked back to my cabin as the sun was setting. The agents set up their equipment and told me they'd be staying the night to observe the pack's behavior. I was supposed to stay inside and let them handle everything, but I couldn't sleep. Something was wrong about these men and their sudden appearance. In 12 years as a ranger, I'd never seen Fish and Wildlife agents with military equipment. And how had they known to come looking for this specific wolf pack? Around 2 a.m., I heard gunfire. I grabbed my rifle and looked out the window. The 3 agents were spread out in the clearing, shooting at something in the tree line. Muzzle flashes lit up the forest, and I could hear bullets hitting trees and rocks. But I couldn't see what they were shooting at. The gunfire stopped suddenly. One of the agents was on the radio, calling for backup. I heard him say, "The subjects are more organized than expected. We need additional support." Subjects? What kind of fish and wildlife operation referred to wolves as subjects? I decided to sneak out the back of the cabin and see what was really happening. But when I opened the rear door, I came face to face with the biggest wolf I'd ever seen. It was standing just 10 feet away, staring directly at me. Its eyes reflected the light from inside the cabin, and for a moment I felt like I was looking at something that understood exactly who I was and what I was doing there. The wolf didn't growl or show its teeth. It just watched me for several long seconds, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. In the morning, the 3 agents were gone. Their equipment was missing, their helicopter was gone, and there was no sign they'd ever been there, except for bullet holes in the trees and empty shell casings scattered around the cabin. I tried calling park headquarters on the emergency radio, but the response confused me even more. "There are no fish and wildlife agents assigned to your area," the dispatcher told me. "And we don't have any record of Dr. Martinez being reported missing." According to the official records, Sarah was supposed to be on vacation in California. Her research camp had never existed. My reports about unusual wolf behavior had never been filed. Someone was erasing the evidence of what had happened. And I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about a rogue wolf pack. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying in the cabin, I packed my essential gear and hiked to an old hunting shelter about 3 miles away. Something told me the wolves knew exactly where I lived, and I needed to break the pattern. I was right. Around midnight, I heard the sound of my cabin being destroyed. From the ridge above the shelter, I could see lights and movement around my research station. But these weren't wolves making the noise. There were vehicles, more men with equipment, and what sounded like construction work. Someone was cleaning up the scene, making it look like I'd never been there at all. I spent the next day hiding and watching, trying to figure out who these people were and what they wanted. Late in the afternoon, I overheard a radio conversation that changed everything. "The Wolfhart situation is contained," a voice said. "Research data has been recovered, and the witness is isolated. Proceed with termination of remaining subjects." Subjects. They kept using that word about the wolves. "What about the memory inheritance factor?" another voice asked. "That's why we're here. The 1943 protocol failed to account for genetic information transfer. These animals have retained tactical knowledge from their predecessors." 1943. I knew that date. It was when the government had used poison to kill most of the wolf population in this area. Officially, it was to protect caribou herds. But what if there had been another reason? That night, I decided to find the pack and try to understand what was really happening. If these wolves were as intelligent as they seemed, maybe I could communicate with them somehow. I found them at the old den site near Wonder Lake. All 8 adults were there, arranged in a perfect circle around a pile of objects I recognized. Pieces of equipment from various research camps, arranged like some kind of altar. As I approached, they turned to look at me, but none of them ran away or showed aggression. The largest one, a black male that had to weigh at least 120 pounds, stepped forward and did something that froze my blood. It sat down and tilted its head, exactly the way Sarah used to do when she was thinking about a complex problem. Then it walked over to the pile of equipment and used its nose to push items around, arranging them into patterns. Letters. It was spelling out words. Remember. Justice. Revenge. I stared at the words spelled out in camping gear and scientific instruments, trying to process what I was seeing. These wolves weren't just intelligent, they were trying to communicate complex ideas. The black wolf looked at me and then walked to another part of the clearing. It started digging, and the rest of the pack joined in. Within minutes, they'd uncovered something that had been buried there. Human bones, old ones, from the look of them. And mixed in with the bones were pieces of metal, collars, tags, and what looked like radio equipment from the 1942. I understood then. These weren't just wolves. They were the descendants of wolves that had been used in some kind of government experiment decades ago. And somehow, they'd passed down memories of what had been done to them. The sound of helicopters approaching made us all look up. Spotlights were sweeping the area, and I could hear men shouting orders. The cleanup crew had found us. The pack leader looked at me one more time, and in its eyes I saw something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just animal intelligence, it was human intelligence, the kind that could plan and remember and want revenge. The wolves scattered into the forest as the helicopters landed. Armed men poured out, shouting orders and spreading out to surround the area. These weren't fish and wildlife agents. They were military, with equipment designed for hunting something very dangerous. I ran toward the tree line, but one of the soldiers saw me and started shooting. I dove behind a fallen log as bullets splintered the wood around me. "Target is mobile," I heard someone shout. "Initiate containment protocol." I was crawling through the underbrush when I heard the howling start. But this wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from behind the soldiers. The pack had circled around and was attacking from the rear. I heard screaming and gunfire, then more screaming. The wolves were using the same tactical coordination I'd seen in their tracks, working together. to take down armed men. I kept crawling until I reached a small stream, then followed it downstream, staying low and trying to put distance between me and the fighting. Behind me, the gunfire was getting sporadic. The screaming had mostly stopped. When I finally stopped to rest, I realized I wasn't alone. The black wolf was standing on the opposite bank of the stream, watching me. It crossed the water slowly, deliberately, and I knew my time had run out. I'd seen what this pack could do to trained soldiers. I was just one man with a rifle. But instead of attacking, the wolf sat down in front of me and did something impossible. It spoke, not with words, but with perfect mimicry of human speech patterns. Sarah's voice coming from the wolf's throat. "Daniel, understand, not your fault." Then it changed to other voices. Men I didn't recognize, speaking in older dialects. The poison. Children dying. Remember the pain. Government promised. Food. Brought death. Passed down. Generation to generation. Never forget. The wolf was speaking with the voices of people who had died decades ago. People who had trusted the government and been betrayed. And somehow, their memories had become part of the pack's genetic inheritance. I lowered my rifle. "What do you want from me?" The wolf tilted its head, Sarah's gesture again, and walked back to the stream. It used its paw to write in the mud. "Witness. Tell. Remember." I understood. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted someone to survive and tell the truth about what had happened here, both decades ago and tonight. The sounds of helicopters were getting closer again. The wolf looked at me one more time, then disappeared into the forest. I made it back to the main park road 3 days later, half frozen and nearly dead from exhaustion. The official story was that I'd gotten lost during a routine survey and suffered from exposure and hypothermia. According to the records, Dr. Sarah Martinez had never been assigned to Denali. My research on wolf behavior had been transferred to another scientist, and the Wonder Lake area was permanently closed to researchers due to environmental sensitivity concerns. The men who cleaned up the scene did a thorough job. My cabin had burned down in an accidental fire. The helicopter crash that killed 3 fish and wildlife agents was blamed on bad weather, and the unusual wolf activity I'd reported was attributed to stress-induced hallucinations. But they couldn't erase everything. I kept copies of my photographs hidden in a safety deposit box in Anchorage, pictures of the bone arrangements, the geometric track patterns, and the burial site with its mixture of wolf and human remains. More importantly, I knew the truth about what government scientists had done in 1943, and what they'd tried to do again in 1974. They'd created something they couldn't control. Wolves with inherited memories, passed down through genetic information from parents to offspring. Animals that remembered every betrayal, every act of cruelty, every broken promise made by the people who were supposed to protect them. I never returned to Denali as a ranger. Couldn't bring myself to go back to those woods, knowing what was still out there. But I kept track of the reports that filtered through the Park Service network. Strange animal behavior in areas where predator control programs had been implemented. Wildlife researchers disappearing in regions with histories of government intervention. Coordinated pack attacks that showed tactical thinking beyond normal animal intelligence. The Wonder Lake pack wasn't the only one. They'd been sharing their knowledge with other groups, spreading the inherited memories across the wilderness. Every few months, I get reports from rangers and researchers who've seen things they can't explain. Wolves that seem to recognize specific types of government vehicles. Packs that avoid areas where officials have been spotted, like they're following intelligence reports. Animals that arrange objects in patterns that look like warnings. I'm retired now, living in a small town in Montana, far from the wilderness areas where these things might be happening. But sometimes, when I'm driving the back roads at night, I see eyes reflecting in my headlights that seem too knowing, too intelligent for ordinary wildlife. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear howling that sounds almost like human voices, carrying messages I don't want to understand. The government files on the 1943 program remain classified. The 1974 incident has been buried under layers of bureaucracy and misdirection. As far as the official records show, none of it ever happened. But the wolves remember, and they're still out there, In every wilderness where government programs once tried to control or eliminate, waiting, planning, passing down their memories to new generations that will never forget what was done to their ancestors. If you're a researcher planning to study wolf behavior in areas with histories of predator control, I have one piece of advice. Don't go alone. Don't trust official assurances that everything is safe. And if you see track patterns that look too organized or hear vocalizations that sound too much like language, get out immediately. Because some wounds run deeper than individual memory. Some knowledge gets passed down in ways science doesn't fully understand yet, and some animals never forgive. The pack that remembers is still watching, still waiting, still planning their justice. My name is Bobby Frost, and I'm probably the youngest guy to ever get a job studying glaciers for the National Park Service. At 28, most people think I'm crazy for spending my time on chunks of ice in Alaska, but I love it. There's something about glaciers that gets to me. They're like giant history books made of frozen water, holding secrets from thousands of years ago. I've been working at Glacier Bay National Park for 5 years now, got my fancy degree from MIT, which impressed my boss enough to give me my own research station way out on Muir Glacier. It's not much to look at, just a small building sitting on ice that's 200 feet thick. But it's mine, and I do important work there. Climate change research, they call it. I drill down into the ice and pull up samples to see what the world was like before cars and factories started pumping junk into the air. The thing is, I'm not great with people. Never have been. Give me numbers and data and scientific equipment, and I'm happy as can be. But put me in a room full of folks trying to make small talk, and I freeze up worse than my ice samples. That's probably why I like working alone on the glacier. Just me, my equipment, and the endless white silence. March is a weird time on the glacier. That's when the ice starts breaking up after winter. You can hear it groaning and cracking all day long, like some giant beast stretching after a long sleep. Most researchers clear out during breakup season because it's dangerous. Ice can shift without warning, opening up cracks deep enough to swallow a truck. But I stay. The ice cores I can get during breakup are special. The movement brings up older ice, stuff that's been buried for centuries. My station sits about 50 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by helicopter when the weather's good. And Alaska weather is never good for long. I've got a radio to call for supplies or emergencies, but mostly I'm on my own. That's how I like it. The local native folks have stories about this glacier, old tales about things trapped in the ice, waiting to get out. Ice demons, they call them. Shapeshifters that can look like anyone or anything. I've always been polite when the elders tell these stories, but between you and me, I believe in what I can measure and analyze. If it can't be proven with scientific methods, it's just old superstitions. My equipment is pretty basic but reliable. I've got ice drilling gear that can punch down 100 feet, microscopes for examining samples, and enough scientific instruments to stock a small lab. Everything runs on generators, and I keep careful records of every sample I take. My research could help predict how fast glaciers are melting, which makes it important work. At least, that's what I tell myself during the long, dark nights when the ice creaks and moans around me. The station itself is built on skids so it can move with the glacier. It's painted bright orange, so rescue helicopters can spot it against all that white. Inside, it's warm enough. With my lab equipment, a small kitchen, and a bunk where I sleep. The walls are thin, though, and sometimes at night I can hear the ice shifting beneath me. It's like living on the back of some huge, slow-moving animal. I keep detailed logs of everything. Weather, ice conditions, sample data. My handwriting is neat and precise, just like my work. I take pride in being thorough. Every ice core gets labeled and cataloged. Every measurement gets double-checked. That's what good science is all about. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to those native stories. I wish I'd listened when the old folks warned about things that should stay buried in ice. But I was too smart for my own good, too sure that my education and equipment could explain anything I might find. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It was March 15th when I made the discovery that changed everything. I'd been drilling deeper than usual, trying to reach ice that formed maybe 800 years ago. The drill bit hit something different around 90 feet down. Not harder ice exactly, but ice that felt wrong somehow. When I pulled up the core sample, I knew right away this was special. The ice was clearer than anything I'd seen before, like looking through the finest glass. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was what was frozen inside it. At first glance, it looked like some kind of prehistoric organism. Maybe a foot long, dark, and twisted in a shape I couldn't quite make sense of. It reminded me of a cross between a starfish and an octopus, but the proportions were all wrong. Too many limbs, or maybe too few. I couldn't tell where it began and where it ended. I set up my microscope and started examining it properly. That's when things got really strange. The organism kept changing. Not moving. It was definitely dead and frozen solid. But every time I looked away and then looked back, it seemed different somehow. More arms, or fewer. Different color. Sometimes it looked almost like a small person curled up. Sometimes it didn't look like anything I could name. At first, I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been working long hours, and the constant white of the glacier can mess with your vision. But I'm a scientist, so I started taking photographs. That's when I knew something was really wrong. The photos showed different things each time. In one picture, the organism looked like a twisted bird. In the next, taken just minutes later, it looked like a small mammal with too many legs. The ice core itself was always the same, clear as window glass, but whatever was frozen inside, it kept changing. I tried calling the main station on my radio. Glacier Bay Base, this is Research Station 7. I've made a significant biological discovery. You need to see what I've found. The voice that crackled back sounded tired. What kind of discovery, Bobby? Unknown organism in ancient ice core, perfectly preserved, but unusual characteristics. I need consultation with the biology department. Can you describe it? I stared at the sample again. Right then, it looked like a twisted mass of dark tentacles. It's hard to explain. The preservation is unlike anything in the literature. I think we might have found something new. New how? Unknown species. Maybe unknown classification entirely. There was a long pause. Bobby, unknown doesn't mean alien. Keep documenting, and we'll have someone take a look when the weather clears. But I knew this wasn't just an unknown species. This was something else entirely. I spent the next 3 days photographing and measuring the sample. My records show clear documentation, but looking at them now makes my head hurt. The measurements don't match the photographs. The photographs don't match what I remember seeing. It was like the thing was changing even in my documentation. The ice around it started melting too, which shouldn't have been possible. My lab stays well below freezing, but the core sample got warm to the touch, and water started dripping from it. When I tried to preserve it in the freezer, the ice melted anyway. That's when I started having the dreams. At night, I'd dream I was looking in the mirror, but my reflection would move wrong, turn its head when I didn't turn mine, smile when I wasn't smiling. Sometimes, my reflection had too many fingers. Sometimes, it had the wrong eyes. During the day, I caught myself doing things I didn't remember deciding to do. I'd find notes in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing. Equipment would be moved around. Once, I found my microscope aimed at the window instead of the sample, like something had been watching outside. The organism in the ice kept changing, and now I was starting to change too. My reflection in the lab equipment looked wrong. My shadow seemed to move independently. When I spoke into my voice recorder, the playback sounded like my voice, but saying words I never said. I tried to convince myself it was isolation getting to me. Cabin fever. Too much time alone with weird ice samples. But deep down, I knew something was waking up, something that had been sleeping in that ice for a very, very long time, and it was learning to be me. By the 4th day, I couldn't deny what was happening anymore. The organism wasn't just changing appearance, it was moving. Not like a living thing moves, but like something learning how to be alive. Tiny shifts and twitches inside the ice that shouldn't have been possible. I documented everything, but my notes started getting confused. I'd write down one thing and find something completely different on the page later. My handwriting stayed the same, but the words changed. Sometimes I'd find entries that said things like, "The specimen is adapting well," or "integration," "proceeding normally," things I never would have written. The ice sample had completely melted by then, leaving behind a dark puddle that moved too thick to be water. When I tried to pour it into a container, it seemed to resist, clinging to the lab bench like it didn't want to be moved. Under the microscope, the liquid showed cellular activity that made no sense. Cells that divided and merged randomly. Patterns that looked almost like neurons firing. That's when I remembered the native stories my predecessor had told me about. Before I took this job, an old Tlingit elder named Joseph had visited the station. He'd warned the previous researcher about things sleeping in the old ice, things that had been put there on purpose long ago. Some prisons aren't made of stone and steel, he'd said. Some are made of ice and time. I'd filed it away as folklore, but now I dug out my predecessor's notes. Dr. Helen Martinez had been studying this same area before she disappeared 3 years ago. Her final entries were strange, talking about mimetic organisms and cellular reconstruction capabilities. Her last entry just said, "It's learning to be me. If I start acting strange, don't trust me, don't let me leave." She'd never made it to her scheduled pickup. They found her station empty, all her equipment still running. No sign of struggle, no body, nothing missing, except Helen herself. The official report blamed a crevasse accident, but no one ever found her. Reading her notes made my hands shake. She'd found the same kind of organism I had. She documented the same impossible changes, and then she'd vanished. That night, I woke up to find myself standing outside in the snow. I was barefoot and wearing just my thermal underwear, but I wasn't cold. That should have been impossible. The temperature was 20 below zero. I should have been dead in minutes. I looked down at my feet and saw that my footprints in the snow were wrong. Too long, with marks where toes should be but shaped like claws. When I lifted my foot to look, it was normal again. Human. 5 toes, just like always. Back inside, I tried to radio for an emergency evacuation, but the voice that came out of my mouth wasn't quite right. The words were mine, but the tone was off, like someone doing an impression of me who hadn't quite figured out how I really sounded. Glacier Bay Base, this is Research Station 7, requesting immediate extraction. Bobby, you sound weird. Everything okay? I tried to answer, but the voice that came out said, "False alarm. Everything is proceeding normally. Do not send helicopter." I hadn't meant to say that. The words just came out. I grabbed the radio microphone and tried again. "No, I need extraction now. There's something wrong here." But the transmission that went out was, "Sorry for confusion. Radio malfunction. All normal here." Something else was using my voice. Something that didn't want me to leave. I smashed the radio with a hammer, but the damage was done. No more communication with the outside world. That's when I started seeing them. Other versions of myself. I'd catch glimpses and reflections on my equipment. Me, but standing in places I wasn't standing. Me, but wearing clothes I wasn't wearing. Me, but with details that were just slightly wrong. One had my face but brown eyes instead of blue. Another had the right eyes but the wrong hands, fingers too long, joints bending in impossible directions. A third looked exactly like me except it was smiling, and I definitely wasn't smiling. They started showing up more often. In the peripheral vision of my good eye. In photographs that developed with extra figures. In the bathroom mirror, standing behind me when I brushed my teeth. The worst part was that they were all studying me. Watching how I moved, how I talked, how I held my coffee cup or tied my boots. They were learning to be more convincing. Copies. I found a journal entry in my handwriting that I definitely didn't write. The original memories are useful but not essential. Physical duplication proceeds according to template. Integration with local environment 73% complete. Expansion to inhabited areas should begin soon. My own hand had written those words, but they weren't my thoughts. I realized that whatever had been in that ice wasn't just one organism. It was something that could divide and multiply. Something that could become perfect copies of anything it studied long enough. And I'd been its only teacher for days. How many of me were there now? How long before I couldn't tell which one was really me? On the 7th day, I heard the helicopter coming. The sound of rotor blades should have been the most beautiful thing in the world. Rescue. Extraction. Proof that the outside world still existed beyond this frozen nightmare I'd stumbled into. But all I could think about was how many of me might try to get on that helicopter. I watched through my window as the aircraft circled the station, looking for a safe place to land on the unstable ice. The pilot was Sarah Chen, someone I'd flown with dozens of times. She was good at her job and careful about ice conditions. She'd know if something was wrong. Or would she? I checked myself in the mirror one more time. Still me, as far as I could tell. Blue eyes, check. Small scar on my left cheek from a childhood accident, check. Crooked bottom teeth that I'd never gotten fixed, check. But how could I be sure? The other versions looked exactly like me now. The helicopter touched down about 50 yards from my station, rotors still spinning. Sarah would wait exactly 5 minutes. Standard extraction protocol for unstable ice. If I didn't come out by then, she'd leave and report equipment problems. I grabbed my emergency kit and opened the station door. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to run toward the helicopter. That's when I saw him. Another me was already running from the opposite direction. Same clothes, same emergency kit, same desperate expression on his face. He looked exactly like me, moved exactly like me, even had the same slight limp I'd developed from sleeping on the station's cheap mattress. We both reached the helicopter at the same time. Sarah looked confused, her eyes darting between us. "Bobby, what the hell?" "I'm Bobby," we both said at exactly the same time. Same voice, same inflection, same desperate tone. "There's something in the ice," the other me said. "Something that makes copies. Don't trust him, he's not real." "That's exactly what I was going to say," I shouted back. "Sarah, look at his watch, it's on the wrong wrist." But when I checked, both our watches were on our left wrists, exactly where mine always was. Sarah pulled out her sidearm, a standard-issue pistol that pilots carried for emergency wildlife encounters. Her hands shook as she pointed it back and forth between us. "Okay, this is insane, but I need proof. One of you isn't Bobby. Tell me something only Bobby would know." "Your daughter's name is Emma," we both said. "She's 7 years old and she wants to be a pilot like her mom." Sarah's face went pale. "How do you both know that?" "I never told Bobby about Emma." That's when I realized the truth. The thing hadn't just been copying me. It had been copying my memories, too. But it was also learning things I'd never known, accessing information I'd never heard. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was becoming something more than me. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you have to shoot us both." "What?" "You can't risk taking either of us back. If even one of us isn't real, and you bring it to town." I thought about the liquid organism, how it had divided and multiplied in my lab, how it had learned to be me by watching me for just a few days. "How many people live in Glacier Bay?" "About 500, she whispered. "And how long would it take this thing to copy all of them?" The other me laughed, and the sound was wrong. Too confident, too knowing. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Bobby. But it's too late. I've already sent samples ahead." "What? Those helicopter supply drops you've been getting?" "I've been sending ice core samples back with them, marked as routine geological specimens. They're sitting in the Park Service lab right now, thawing out." Sarah raised her gun higher. "Both of you, shut up." But the other me kept talking. "The beautiful thing about humans is how trusting they are, how eager to help. Dr. Peterson probably took those samples home to study in his personal lab. Maybe his wife made him coffee while he worked. Maybe his kids looked through the microscope." "Sarah," I said urgently, "radio the Park Service. Tell them to quarantine the geology lab. Tell them to burn everything that came from Station 7. "I can't do that and fly at the same time." "Then leave us both and go warn them." "No," the other me snarled, and suddenly it didn't look exactly like me anymore. Its face was shifting, features flowing like melting wax. "I won't let you ruin this." That's when Sarah started shooting. She emptied her entire clip, hitting both of us multiple times. I felt the bullets tear through my chest, hot and devastating. I fell backward onto the ice, blood spreading underneath me in a growing pool of red. But the other me didn't fall right. It collapsed like a punctured balloon, dark liquid leaking out instead of blood. The liquid moved across the ice with purpose, trying to reach me, trying to reach Sarah, trying to reach anything warm and alive. Sarah was already back in the helicopter, lifting off. Through my fading vision, I could see her talking frantically into her radio as the aircraft gained altitude. I hoped she was warning them. I hoped she would make it in time. But as I lay there dying on the ice, I could see dark shapes moving under the surface. The original organism wasn't gone. It was vast, spread throughout the glacier like veins of infection. And with the ice melting faster each year due to climate change, it was all going to get out eventually. My last thought before everything went black was a question. What else was frozen in the world's glaciers, waiting for the ice to melt? The official report blamed toxic gas exposure from the ice cores. According to the Park Service, researcher Robert Frost suffered hallucinations and paranoid delusions before dying in a helicopter evacuation attempt. Pilot Sarah Chen was treated for trauma after being forced to defend herself against an armed and delusional scientist. The geology lab was quietly evacuated and sterilized after what officials called a contamination incident involving unknown biological agents. Dr. Peterson and his family were quarantined for observation but showed no symptoms of infection. The ice core samples were incinerated as a precautionary measure. Sarah Chen retired from flying 6 months later. She never spoke publicly about what happened on the glacier, but those who knew her said she'd developed an intense fear of ice. She moved to Arizona and refused to own a freezer. Glacier Bay National Park suspended all research operations on Muir Glacier indefinitely. The official reason was unstable ice conditions and budget constraints, but no researchers have been allowed back since. The area is now marked as hazardous and off-limits to all personnel. But the glaciers keep melting. Every year, more ancient ice disappears. Every year, things that have been frozen for millennia are exposed to sunlight for the first time in recorded history. Scientists around the world report finding unusual biological specimens in melting permafrost and ice sheets. Most are dismissed as previously unknown bacteria or viruses. Most are destroyed before they can be properly studied. Most, but not all. In Siberia, a research team found perfectly preserved organisms in thawing permafrost. 3 team members died in what officials called equipment malfunctions, but local witnesses reported seeing multiple versions of the same person before the facility was evacuated and sealed. In Greenland, an ice core drilling operation was abandoned after researchers reported anomalous findings. The site remains closed, surrounded by warning signs in multiple languages. In Antarctica, satellite images show unusual patterns of ice melt around research stations. Several facilities have gone dark, their last transmissions reporting routine scientific work before all communication ceased. The climate scientists are right about one thing. The ice is melting faster than anyone predicted. But they don't know about the other consequences. They don't know what's waking up as the world warms. Sometimes I wonder if we're not just witnessing climate change. Maybe we're witnessing something much older and more deliberate. Maybe the things sleeping in the ice have been waiting for exactly this moment, when human activity would free them from their frozen prisons. Maybe global warming isn't our biggest problem after all. Maybe it's just the beginning. Late at night, when the news shows footage of melting glaciers and rising sea levels, I think about Bobby Frost. I think about the thing that learned to be him. I think about how quickly it adapted, how perfectly it copied not just his appearance but his memories and knowledge. And I wonder, in a world where the ice is melting everywhere, how would we even know if they're already among us? How would we know if they've been among us for years? After all, the perfect copy doesn't just look like the original. It believes it is the original. And if something can copy memories along with flesh, how? Could even the copy itself know what it really is? These are the thoughts that keep me awake at night. These are the questions I can't stop asking. Because sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I'm not entirely sure who's looking back. My name is Samuel Broken Arrow, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. People call me Sam. I work at Katmai National Monument in Alaska, where the bears are bigger than cars and the land still steams from old volcanoes. I'm half Alutiiq, which means I know the old stories. My grandmother told them to me when I was small. She said, the spirits have rules, just like people do. Break the rules, and bad things happen. I went to college and learned about science, but I never forgot what Grandma taught me. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes is my beat. It got that name because after the big volcano blew up in 1912, Steam kept rising from the ground for years. Even now, you can see wisps of vapor coming up through the rocks. The air smells like sulfur and old fire. Most tourists don't come here. It's too far from the main roads, too hard to reach. The few hunters who make it this far know to respect the old places. There are burial grounds scattered around the valley, places where my people lived before the mountain exploded and buried everything. September means salmon time. The fish swim up the rivers to spawn, and the bears follow. Big brown bears, some over 1,000 pounds. They're dangerous, but they follow patterns. I know where they go, and when. I've learned to read their signs like words on a page. That morning started normal. I was checking trap cameras near Knife Creek when my radio crackled. "Sam, you there?" It was Pete Martinez from headquarters. "Yeah, Pete. What's up?" "Got a problem. Hunting party called in a bear attack. 3 guys went out yesterday near the old village site. Only 2 came back." I felt my stomach drop. The old village site was sacred ground. My great-grandfather was born there, before the volcano changed everything. "How bad?" I asked. "Real bad. The survivor says something tore his buddy apart. Fish and Game wants you to check it out, since you know the area." I packed my gear fast. Rifle, first aid kit, radio, and something else. A small leather pouch my grandmother gave me. Inside were sage and other things for ceremonies. I hadn't used it in years, but something told me to bring it. The drive to the village site took an hour over rough trail. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. No bears. During salmon season, this area should be crawling with them. Instead, the forest was quiet. Even the birds seemed to have left. I found the survivors at their camp. 2 men in their 30s, both pale and shaking. One was Tom Bradley, a lawyer from Anchorage. The other was his cousin, Rick. "Where's your friend?" I asked. Tom pointed toward a grove of trees. "Over there." We couldn't move him. I walked into the trees and found what was left of the 3rd man. I've seen bear attacks before, but this was different. The body was arranged in a circle of stones, like someone had placed it there carefully. Bear attacks are messy, violent. This looked almost ceremonial. "Tell me what happened," I said when I came back. Rick looked at his hands. "We were looking for artifacts. Tom heard you could find old native stuff around here." My blood went cold. "What kind of artifacts?" "Arrowheads, pottery, maybe some jewelry. We found this old burial mound and started digging." Tom's voice was barely a whisper. "You dug up a grave?" "Just a little. Then Jimmy found something carved from bone, a bear claw or something. Soon as he picked it up, we heard this sound." "What kind of sound?" "What kind of sound?" "Like singing, but not human singing. It came from everywhere at once." I closed my eyes and tried to stay calm. These idiots had robbed a grave on sacred ground during salmon season, when the spirits were already active. "Where's this carved thing now?" Tom pointed to their truck. "In the cooler. We were going to take it home." I walked to their truck and opened the cooler. Inside, wrapped in a towel, was a piece of kennet, carved ivory, shaped like a bear claw. But it wasn't just any carving. The symbols on it were old, older than anything I'd seen. This was a shaman's tool, something used for talking to spirits. As soon as I touched it, I heard the singing. The singing came from the direction of the old burial ground. It sounded like voices calling across water, sad and angry at the same time. I knew some of the words, old Alutiiq prayers for the dead. "You guys need to leave," I told Tom and Rick. "Right now." "What about Jimmy's body?" Tom asked. "I'll handle it. Just go." They didn't argue. Within 10 minutes, their truck was speeding down the trail, leaving dust clouds behind. I was alone with the carved claw and the singing that shouldn't exist. My radio crackled. "Sam, this is base. What's your status?" I picked up the radio to answer, but the voice that came out wasn't Pete's. It was an old woman speaking Alutiiq, words I barely understood. Something about the dead, wanting to come home. I turned the radio off and checked the frequency. It was set correctly. But when I turned it back on, the old woman's voice was still there. I needed to see the burial ground. The singing was getting louder, and I could feel something watching me from the trees. The walk to the grave site took 15 minutes. I found the hole Tom and Rick had dug, about 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. They'd scattered bones and burial goods around like garbage. Pottery shards, pieces of carved wood, and what looked like human teeth were mixed with dirt and rocks. But the worst part was the smell. Not rot or decay, something else, like wet fur and old blood. I started putting the bones back in the ground, trying to remember the prayers my grandmother taught me. As I worked, I noticed tracks in the soft earth around the hole. Bear tracks, but wrong somehow. Too big, and the claws marks were too deep. No bear in Alaska had claws that long. The tracks led away, from the grave toward the tree line. I followed them for maybe 50 yards before they disappeared at a patch of bare rock. That's when I saw the bear. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. At first glance, it looked like a normal brown bear, maybe 8 feet tall when standing. But its eyes were wrong. Instead of the black or brown eyes bears have, this one's eyes were pale blue, almost white. Human eyes. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. Then it dropped to all fours and walked into the forest without making a sound. Bears are heavy. They crack branches and rustle leaves when they move. This one moved like smoke. I finished putting the bones back and said the prayers I remembered. The singing stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Human footsteps walking around the burial site in a circle. I looked around but saw nothing. The footsteps kept going, slow and steady, like someone performing a ceremony. I could hear the grass being crushed and small stones being kicked, but there was nobody there. My radio came to life again. This time it was Pete's voice, but strange and distant. "Sam, we're getting reports of bear problems all over the valley. 3 different sightings in the last hour. Thing is, they're all of the same bear." "That's impossible," I said. "Yeah, that's what I thought." But all 3 witnesses described the same animal. Huge brown bear with pale eyes. One guy saw it near Knife Creek. Another saw it at the same time 15 miles away near Fox Lake. Third sighting was at the old village site. I looked at my watch. The times Pete mentioned were exactly when I saw the bear here. "I'll check it out," I said. "Be careful, Sam. Something's got the wildlife acting strange all over the park." I packed up my gear and started back to my truck. The sun was getting low, and shadows were growing long between the trees. Every few steps, I heard something moving parallel to me, staying just out of sight. At my truck, I found fresh bear tracks around the tires. Not just around them, under them, like the bear had walked through solid metal. I drove back toward headquarters as fast as I dared on the rough trail. In my rearview mirror, I could see a large, dark shape following behind, keeping pace with my truck even when I hit 40 miles per hour. No bear can run that fast for that long. I spent that night at the ranger station, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the singing. And every time I looked out the window, I saw pale eyes watching from the tree line. Morning brought bad news. Pete handed me 3 incident reports that came in overnight. More bear problems. Jim Walsh found his hunting camp torn apart. Says something scattered his gear in perfect circles around his tent. Frank Newton called from his cabin. Says there's a bear on his roof that won't come down, just sits there staring at him. I read the reports. All 3 incidents happened at the same time, but miles apart. And all 3 witnesses described the same bear with pale blue eyes. "There's more," Pete said. Sarah Kim from the university called. She's doing research on the 1912 eruption. Says she found something in the archives you need to see. Dr. Sarah Kim met me at the ranger station an hour later. She was a small woman with serious eyes and a thick folder full of old papers. "I've been researching the Katmai eruption for my dissertation," she said. "Most people know it destroyed several native villages, but what they don't know is how many people were never properly buried." She opened the folder and showed me old photographs and documents. The eruption happened so fast that many villagers couldn't perform traditional burial ceremonies. According to these missionary reports, at least 200 people died in the valley and were buried in mass graves, or left unburied completely. "What does that have to do with anything?" Pete asked. "In Alutiiq tradition," I said slowly, "people who don't get proper burial rites don't rest peacefully. Their spirits get trapped between worlds." Sarah nodded. "And according to these documents, the old village site where you found the disturbed grave yesterday was one of the largest unburied sites. The missionary who wrote this report says the survivors had to flee before they could honor their dead." She showed me a photograph, from 1913. It showed the valley covered in volcanic ash, with dark shapes scattered across the landscape. When I looked closer, I realized the shapes were bodies. How many? I asked. In that village alone, maybe 80 people. I felt sick. Tom and Rick hadn't just robbed one grave. They'd disturbed a mass burial site where dozens of spirits had been waiting over 50 years for someone to honor them properly. My radio crackled. Sam, we got an emergency. Frank Newton's in trouble at his cabin. I grabbed my gear and drove to Frank's place as fast as I could. His cabin sat on a hill overlooking Knife Creek, about 10 miles from the old village site. I found Frank barricaded inside, shouting through the door, "It's still up there. Been on my roof for 6 hours." I looked up. There was nothing on the roof. "Frank, there's no bear up there." "Are you crazy? Look at the size of that thing." I walked around the cabin. No bear tracks, no claw marks on the walls, no sign of any animal. But Frank kept insisting he could see a huge brown bear sitting on his chimney. "Describe it," I said through the door. "Biggest bear I ever saw. Must be 12 feet long. And its eyes, they look like a person's eyes." I climbed onto Frank's woodshed to get a better look at the roof. Still nothing. But as I stood there, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Breathing. Heavy, slow breathing, right behind me. I turned around and saw the bear standing on the ground below, looking up at me. This close, I could see it clearly. It was bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, with scars across its face that looked like ritual markings. And its eyes weren't just pale blue, they were intelligent. It was studying me like I was studying it. The bear opened its mouth and spoke. "You know what they want," it said in a voice like wind through dry grass. I nearly fell off the woodshed. Bears don't talk. Bears don't have human eyes. Bears don't appear and disappear like ghosts. "What are you?" I whispered. "I am the voice of the forgotten dead. They sent me to make things right." The bear turned and walked toward the forest. After a few steps, it looked back at me. "The bones must return to their homes. The ceremonies must be completed, or more will die." Then it vanished between the trees. Frank opened his cabin door. "Where'd it go?" "That thing was just on my roof a second ago." I climbed down from the woodshed with shaking hands. "Frank, pack a bag. You need to leave the valley for a few days." "Why? What's going on?" "Something that should have been taken care of 50 years ago." That night, I called my grandmother. She was 83 and lived in the native village 200 miles away, but her mind was still sharp. "Grandmother, I need to know about the old burial ceremonies, the ones from before the missionary times." "Why do you ask such things, Samuel?" I told her everything. About the disturbed grave, the singing voices, the bear that spoke like a person. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The dead are walking," she said finally. "When burial ceremonies are not completed, spirits cannot find their way to the other side. They choose a guardian from the animal world to speak for them." "How do I make them rest?" "You must do what should have been done 50 years ago." "But Samuel, this is dangerous." "The bear spirit will not harm you if you respect its mission, but others may not understand. And if the ceremony fails?" "What happens if it fails?" "The dead will never rest, and the living will not be safe in that valley ever again." The next morning brought the call I'd been dreading. Pete's voice was tight with worry. "Sam, we got a situation. Fish and Game sent a team to hunt the rogue bear. They're heading to the valley with tranquilizers and tracking equipment." My heart sank. "When?" "They'll be at the old village site by noon." I looked at my watch. It was already 10:30. If the Fish and Game team started shooting tranquilizers at a spirit bear, there was no telling what might happen. I grabbed the carved bear claw from my desk drawer and the leather pouch my grandmother had given me. Then I drove toward the valley faster than I'd ever driven before. I reached the old village site just as the Fish and Game truck pulled up. 3 men got out, carrying rifles loaded with tranquilizer darts. "Afternoon, Sam," said the team leader, a guy named Marcus Webb I'd worked with before. "Heard you had a problem bear in this area. Marcus, you need to leave. This isn't what you think." "Come on, Sam, it's just a big brown bear. Probably sick or injured. That's why it's acting strange. We'll trank it, relocate it somewhere safe." I tried to explain, but how do you tell someone that they're hunting a spirit? Marcus and his team thought I was suffering from stress or too much time alone in the wilderness. They set up their equipment near the burial ground. Within an hour, they'd found tracks and started following them into the forest. I followed behind, staying far enough back that they couldn't send me away. The tracks led deeper into the valley, toward a part of the forest I'd never explored. The trees grew closer together here, and the air smelled of sulfur and something else, something old and wild. We'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when Marcus suddenly stopped and raised his rifle. "There," he whispered, pointing ahead. The bear stood in a clearing about 50 yards away. In daylight, I could see how wrong it really was. Its fur seemed to shift and move like it was alive on its own, and it was huge. Not just big for a bear, but impossibly large. If it stood on its hind legs, it would be taller than a small tree. Marcus fired his tranquilizer gun. The dart hit the bear in the shoulder, but instead of sticking, it passed right through like the bear was made of smoke. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered. The bear turned toward us. When it spoke, all three men could hear it. "You do not belong here. Leave, or join the forgotten dead." Marcus and his team ran. I don't blame them. I wanted to run too, but I had the bear claw in my pocket and words from my grandmother in my head. "You're the guardian spirit," I said when we were alone. "I am the voice of 83 souls who died in terror and were left without honor," the bear said. "For 57 years, we have waited for someone to complete our journey to the spirit world. What do you need me to do?" The bear walked closer. This near, I could see that its fur wasn't really brown. It was made up of shadows and memories, images of faces and hands and eyes, the faces of the people who died in the eruption. "You have the ceremonial tool," it said, looking at my pocket where I kept the carved claw, "and you have the old knowledge. Perform the death rites that were never performed. Give us peace. And if I can't, then we will remain, and others will die until someone does what must be done." I pulled out the carved bear claw and my grandmother's pouch. Inside the pouch were sage, sweet grass, tobacco, and a small piece of carved jade my great-grandfather had worn. "I don't know all the old words," I admitted. "Speak from your heart," the bear said. "The Baradat. Spirits know your intent." I built a small fire using matches and dry wood. The bear watched as I burned the sacred plants and spoke the prayers my grandmother had taught me, asking the spirits to find peace and begin their journey to the other side. As I spoke, the air around us began to change. I could hear voices, not singing this time, but talking quietly among themselves. Old voices speaking Alutaik, saying goodbye to the world they'd been trapped in for so long. The bear began to change too. Its massive form grew transparent, and I could see through it to the forest beyond. The shadow faces in its fur grew clearer, and I recognized some of them from old photographs in the village museum. "Thank you," the bear said, and its voice was no longer one voice but many voices speaking together. "We can rest now." The fire burned down to ashes, the voices faded, and the bear was gone. I sat alone in the clearing as the sun set, feeling empty and exhausted. But for the first time in days, the forest felt normal again. Birds were singing. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a real bear crashing through the underbrush, following a salmon stream. The dead had finally gone home. The official report I filed was simple. Investigation revealed normal brown bear behavior. Animal relocated successfully outside park boundaries. No further incidents expected. Marcus Webb and his team never talked about what they saw in the forest. When anyone asked, they just said the bear disappeared into thick brush and they lost the trail. Frank Newton moved away from the valley a week later. He told people he was tired of the isolation, but I think he remembered more than he wanted to admit. Tom Bradley and Rick never came back to Katmai. I heard through the Park Service grapevine that Tom had donated a large sum of money to the Alaska Native Heritage Foundation, specifically for protecting burial sites. I requested a transfer to the Cultural Preservation Department. My new job involves working with Native communities to identify and protect sacred sites throughout Alaska. It's quieter work, but more important than I used to think. The old village site is now officially designated as culturally sensitive land. No hunting, no artifact collecting, no unauthorized access. I check on it regularly, and it stays peaceful. But I've learned something troubling in my new job. The Katmai incident wasn't unique. There are dozens of burial sites across Alaska that were disturbed by the 1912 eruption. places where traditional ceremonies were never completed. Last month, I got a call from a ranger at Denali. They're having problems with a pack of wolves that appears and disappears without tracks. The wolves were first seen near a site where gold miners disturbed a burial ground in 1923. 2 weeks ago, a colleague in southeast Alaska reported strange sightings of ravens that speak in human voices. The incidents center around a village cemetery that was flooded when a dam was built in 1954. I've started keeping files on these cases, trying to map the pattern. My grandmother was right about the old rules. Disturb the dead without honoring them, and they'll find a way to make themselves heard. The spirits have patience, but they don't forget. And when the living ignore their responsibilities to the dead, nature itself will step in to restore the balance. I carry my grandmother's pouch with me everywhere now, along with the knowledge that some problems can't be solved with tranquilizer guns and incident reports. Some problems require older solutions, older wisdom. The bear claw I found at the gravesite sits on my desk at the new office. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on burial site protection cases, I swear I can hear it humming softly, not threatening, but reminding me that my work isn't finished. There are too many forgotten places, too many disturbed graves, too many spirits, still waiting for someone to help them find their way home. But that's a story for another time. My name is Samuel Broken Arrow, and I know the old spirits are real. They have rules and reasons, just like the living world. The trick is learning to listen. My name is Lisa Blackwater, and I've been a park ranger for 8 years now. Before that, I was in the Navy, diving in places I'm not supposed to talk about. Some things happen down there that still wake me up at night, covered in sweat and gasping for air like I'm drowning. October in Alaska's Inside Passage is no joke. The water's so cold it'll kill you in minutes, and the storms come fast and mean. That's why when the Coast Guard called about a missing fishing boat, I knew it was going to be bad. The Times Sarah's Dreamtimes was found floating empty near Glacier Bay, her hull torn open from underneath. 3 crew members gone without a trace. The boat looked like something had grabbed it from below and tried to drag it down. I stood on the dock in Ketchikan, looking at the damaged vessel they'd towed in. The holes in the bottom weren't from rocks or ice. They were round, smooth, like something with suction cups had latched on and pulled. But the biggest sucker marks I'd ever seen were maybe 6 inches across. These were the size of dinner plates. "What do you think did this?" asked Captain Rodriguez from the Coast Guard. He was young, maybe 25, with that look new officers get when they see something they can't explain. I ran my fingers along the edge of one of the holes. The metal was bent inward, and there was a smell I remembered from my Navy days, something like rotten seaweed mixed with ammonia. "I don't know," I lied. But whatever it was big. The truth was, I had seen damage like this before, in waters so deep and dark that sunlight had never touched them. Places where things lived that weren't supposed to exist. Things that the Navy pretended weren't there. My diving gear was already loaded in my boat. I'd been a technical diver for 15 years, certified to go deeper than most people ever would. The Coast Guard wanted me to search the area where they found the Times Sarah's Dream asterisk to look for bodies or maybe find some clue about what happened. "You sure you want to go out there alone?" Rodriguez asked. "Weather's supposed to get worse." I looked out at the gray water, choppy with whitecaps. In the distance, dark clouds were building up against the mountains. "I've dived in worse," I said, which was true. But those other times, I'd had a whole team with me. This time, it was just me and whatever was down there. The boat ride out took 2 hours, fighting through swells that got bigger as I went deeper into the fjord. This wasn't a place tourists ever saw. The water was over 800 feet deep in spots, dropping off into underwater canyons that went down further than anyone had ever measured. I anchored near where they'd found the fishing boat. The depth finder showed 300 feet straight down, then nothing. Just empty black water stretching into the deep. I'd done plenty of dives at that depth, but something felt different about this place. Wrong somehow. While I suited up, I tried to remember everything I could about the missing fisherman. Tom Henley, 42, been fishing these waters for 20 years. His son Jake, 19, just out of high school. And old Pete Santos, who'd been working boats since before I was born. Good men who knew the water and respected it. They wouldn't have done anything stupid. The diving computer on my wrist beeped as I ran through my safety checks. Air supply good, depth gauge working, underwater camera charged. I had maybe an hour at that depth before I'd have to start worrying about nitrogen narcosis, the drunk feeling that kills divers who go too deep, too long. I spit in my mask, rinsed it out, and put it on. The water was so cold I could feel it through my thick wetsuit as soon as I stepped in. Taking a deep breath through my regulator, I let myself sink into the dark water. At 50 feet, the sunlight faded to a dim green glow. At 100, it was like swimming through thick soup. By the time I hit 200 feet, I needed my dive light to see anything at all. The beam cut through the water, showing me nothing but empty space and occasional bits of floating debris. That's when I noticed something was wrong. In all my years diving, I'd never seen water so completely empty of life. No fish, no kelp, no sea stars or crabs. Nothing. It was like everything that lived here had just left. My depth gauge read 250 feet when I saw the first sucker mark on the rocky bottom. It was carved into solid stone, a perfect circle bigger than a manhole cover. And it wasn't alone. The entire ocean floor was covered with them, like something massive had crawled across the rocks, leaving its prints behind. I took pictures with my underwater camera, trying to get a sense of scale. Some of the marks were fresh, still filled with the same organic slime I'd smelled on the boat. Others looked older, worn smooth by the current. Whatever made them had been here a long time. Following the trail of marks, I swam deeper, into a narrow canyon between two underwater cliffs. My light beam barely reached the walls on either side. This was the kind of place where divers disappeared and were never found again. That's when I heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist underwater, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the water. I stopped swimming and listened. The sound was coming from somewhere below me, deeper than my lights could reach. Checking my depth gauge, I saw I was already at 280 feet. Too deep to go much further safely. But I had to know. Those fishermen were down here somewhere, and I was the only one who could find them. Taking slow, careful breaths, I let myself sink deeper into the darkness, following that impossible sound toward whatever was waiting in the deep. The heartbeat sound got louder as I went deeper. At 320 feet, my depth gauge started acting funny, flickering between numbers that didn't make sense. The water pressure should have been crushing, but somehow I felt fine. Better than fine, actually, like the water was supporting me, holding me up. That's when I remembered what happened during my last Navy dive, the one that got me discharged. We'd been investigating reports of a submarine accident in the Mariana Trench. What we found down there wasn't a submarine. It was something that should have been dead for millions of years, something with tentacles thick as telephone poles and intelligence behind eyes the size of car wheels. The Navy classified everything about that dive, made us all sign papers saying we'd never talk about it. But you can't make someone forget what they've seen, no matter how many forms they fill out. My light caught something moving ahead of me, just at the edge of visibility, something long and pale, sliding between the rocks like a snake. But snakes don't grow to be 30 feet long, and they don't live at the bottom of the ocean. I swam closer, camera ready. The tentacle, because that's what it had to be, was wrapped around something dark and heavy. As I got closer, I realized it was a piece of the Times Sarah's Dreams Times hull, the metal twisted and bent like soft candy. The tentacle released the debris and slowly pulled back into a crack in the rock wall. I followed with my light, but the crack was too narrow for me to fit through. On the other side, I could see a space opening up into what looked like a vast underwater cave. My air gauge showed I still had 40 minutes left, plenty of time to explore. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to surface, to get out of the water and never come back. The same instincts that had kept me alive in the Navy, when we'd encountered things that weren't supposed to exist. I forced myself to swim around the rock formation, looking for another way into the cave. The heartbeat sound was definitely coming from in there, steady and strong like the pulse of something enormous and very much alive. Behind the rocks, I found an opening big enough to swim through. The cave beyond was huge, my light beam disappearing into the darkness above and to the sides. But it wasn't empty. The walls were covered with the same round sucker marks I'd seen outside, only these were different. These were moving. I watched in horror as the circular marks on the cave walls shifted and rippled like they were breathing, like the walls themselves were alive. My camera flash went off automatically, and in that split second of bright light, I saw them clearly. The walls weren't rock, they were flesh. I was inside something living, something so big that its body formed the cave around me. And I wasn't alone. Floating in the center of the cave were three shapes I recognized immediately: Tom, Jake, and Pete from the fishing boat. But they weren't dead, not exactly. They were suspended in some kind of clear, thick fluid, their bodies perfectly preserved, but their eyes gone white and staring. Tubes of organic material connected them to the creature's body, feeding off them somehow. I nearly bit through my regulator in shock. These men had been missing for 3 days, but they looked like they'd been here forever, trapped in this thing's digestive system while it slowly consumed them. My movement must have disturbed something, because suddenly the heartbeat sound changed. It got faster, more urgent, and the walls around me started to contract. The cave was getting smaller, and I realized the creature knew I was here. I turned to swim back the way I'd come, but the opening was gone. Where there had been open water before, now there was only smooth, pale flesh. I was trapped inside this thing, just like the fisherman. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I'd been in tight spots before, but this was different. This was like being swallowed alive by something that existed outside the normal rules of reality. My depth gauge was now showing impossible readings: 50 feet, 500 feet, then 50 again, cycling through numbers that couldn't be real. I forced myself to calm down, to think like the technical diver I'd trained to be. There had to be another way out. Creatures this size had to have multiple openings, ways to take in water and food. I just had to find one. Swimming toward what I hoped was the front of the creature, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Eyes. Dozens of them, each one bigger than my entire body, blinking at me from what I now realized was the creature's head. They were intelligent eyes, aware and calculating. This thing wasn't just a mindless predator. It was thinking, planning, deciding what to do with me. One of the massive tentacles I'd seen outside came sliding through the water toward me. It moved with impossible grace for something so huge, reaching out to touch me almost gently. Where it made contact with my wetsuit, the material began to dissolve, eaten away by some kind of acid. I kicked hard, swimming away from the tentacle, but there was nowhere to go. The creature's body surrounded me on all sides. My air gauge showed 20 minutes left, and I was starting to feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis, the fuzzy thinking that comes from breathing compressed air too deep for too long. But as my head got cloudier, I started to understand something. This creature wasn't entirely from our world. It existed partly here, in our reality, and partly somewhere else. That's why my instruments were going crazy, why the water pressure didn't feel right. It was bending the rules of physics around itself. The tentacle reached for me again, and this time I didn't swim away. I needed to understand what it wanted, how it thought. As it touched me, I felt something impossible. A connection, like the creature was trying to communicate. Images flashed through my mind. The ocean as it was millions of years ago, when creatures like this ruled the deep waters. The slow retreat to the deepest trenches as the world changed above. And now, hunger. Terrible, endless hunger as its kind slowly died out, leaving this one alone in the depths. The fishermen weren't just food. They were company, kept alive so it wouldn't be alone anymore. And now it wanted me too, wanted to keep me here in the dark forever. But I also felt something else through that connection. Loneliness, so profound it was like physical pain. This creature had been alone for so long that it had almost forgotten what others of its kind felt like. It was desperate, willing to do anything to not be alone anymore. My 20-minute air alarm beeped, bringing me back to reality. I was running out of time, and if I didn't find a way out soon, I'd join Tom, Jake, and Pete floating in this thing's belly for the rest of my very short life. That's when I remembered the demolitions training from my Navy days. I still carried a small emergency charge in my dive kit, designed to blow holes in ship hulls during rescue operations. It might not kill this creature, but it might hurt it enough to make it let me go. As I reached for the charge, the creature's eyes focused on me with what looked almost like sadness. It knew what I was planning, and it didn't want to hurt me. It just didn't want to be alone. For a moment, I hesitated, What if this was the last of its kind? What if destroying it meant the end of something that had existed since before humans walked the earth? Then I looked at the 3 fishermen floating in their chemical prison, and I knew what I had to do. I pulled the demolition charge from my emergency kit, my hands shaking from cold and nitrogen narcosis. The creature's massive eyes tracked my movements, and I felt another wave of communication wash over me. This time, it wasn't just loneliness, it was fear. This ancient thing, older than civilization, was afraid of my tiny explosive. The tentacles started moving faster now, reaching for me from all directions. I dodged one, then another, but there were too many. One wrapped around my ankle, its skin burning through my wetsuit like acid. I screamed into my regulator, bubbles exploding from my mask. But the pain also cleared my head. The nitrogen narcosis lifted just enough for me to think straight. I armed the charge and jammed it against what looked like a major nerve cluster on the creature's wall. 15 seconds until detonation. The creature must have sensed what was coming because everything went crazy. The walls started contracting violently, trying to crush me. The heartbeat sound became a shriek that I felt in my bones. Tentacles whipped through the water, striking out blindly. I kicked hard toward where I remembered the opening being, counting down in my head. 10 seconds. 9, 8. A massive tentacle caught me across the chest, sending me spinning through the water. My regulator got ripped from my mouth, and suddenly I was breathing seawater. The creature's digestive juices burned my throat and lungs. 5 seconds. 4, 3. I found my regulator and jammed it back in my mouth, clearing it with the last air in my lungs. The creature was pulling back now, trying to get away from the charge, but it was too late. The explosion tore through the water like thunder. The creature's scream was so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. A massive section of its body wall blew apart, and suddenly I was being sucked through the opening by rushing water. I tumbled through darkness, bouncing off rocks and debris. My depth gauge spun wildly. 200 feet, 150, 100. I was rising too fast, but I couldn't control it. The creature's death throes were creating massive currents that tossed me around like a leaf. When I finally stabilized, I was floating at 80 feet in open water. Behind me, the creature was thrashing in its death agonies, massive tentacles breaking the surface of the ocean above. But something was wrong. Even wounded, even dying, it was still moving with purpose. It was following me to the surface. I started my emergency ascent, rising as fast as I dared without getting the bends. But the creature was faster. Tentacles thick as trees erupted from the water around my boat, wrapping around the hull. The engine roared as it tried to pull the boat under. I broke the surface just as my boat disappeared beneath the waves. The creature's massive head followed it up, eyes like black moons staring at me with pure hatred. It had been hiding in the deep for who knows how long, and I'd forced it into the light. Treading water in my wetsuit, I watched in horror as the creature's true size became clear. It had to be over 200 feet long, with dozens of tentacles and a body that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at it. Parts of it looked solid, while other parts seemed to phase in and out of reality like it existed in multiple dimensions at once. The water around me started to warm up, and I realized why. The creature was bleeding, and its blood was like acid. My wetsuit began to dissolve wherever the blood touched it. Soon I'd be swimming in chemical soup that would eat me alive. I started swimming toward shore, but it was over 2 miles away. The creature followed me, moving through the water with impossible grace for something so huge. Every few seconds, a tentacle would break the surface near me, testing the water, getting closer. My emergency radio was still clipped to my gear. I managed to get it working with numb fingers. Coast Guard Ketchikan, this is Ranger Blackwater. I need immediate assistance. I'm under attack by something large. I'm 2 miles southeast of Glacier Bay. The radio crackled. Ranger Blackwater, please repeat. Did you say under attack? Affirmative. I'm in the water. My boat is gone. There's something down here with me, something big. It killed the crew of the Times Sarah's Dream *. We're scrambling a rescue. Helicopter, hold your position. I almost laughed. Hold my position while being hunted by a monster from the deep. But the radio contact gave me hope. Help was coming. That's when I felt something brush against my legs underwater. One of the creature's smaller tentacles, testing me, tasting the chemical signature of my fear. I kicked away from it, but more tentacles were rising from the depths around me. Suddenly, the creature's massive head broke the surface 20 feet away. Up close, I could see that it wasn't like any octopus or squid from Earth. Its skin shifted between colors that didn't have names, and its eyes held an intelligence that was completely alien. This thing had been thinking and planning for millions of years while humans were still figuring out fire. It spoke to me again, not with words but with images forced directly into my brain. I saw the deep trenches where its kind had lived, saw them dying off one by one as the oceans changed. I felt its rage at being the last, its desperate need for companionship, and its decision that if it couldn't have friends, it would have food. The images shifted, showing me what it planned to do with me. I would join the fisherman in its belly, kept alive and aware while it slowly digested my body over weeks or months. But worse than that, it would share its memories with me, force me to experience millions of years of loneliness and hunger. I'd rather drown, a tentacle as thick as my body wrapped around my waist, pulling me toward the creature's mouth. I could see rows of teeth inside, each one longer than my hand. This was it. After everything I'd survived, I was going to end up as food for something that shouldn't exist. Then I heard the helicopter. The Coast Guard rescue bird came in low and fast, its spotlight cutting through the gray afternoon sky. The creature reacted immediately, diving back under the water and taking me with it. We went down fast, 50 feet, 80, 100. The helicopter's light faded above me as the creature pulled me into the depths. But I still had one trick left. The emergency air tank clipped to my gear wasn't just for breathing. It was also pressurized high enough to be used as a weapon. I yanked it free and jammed the valve against one of the creature's eyes. The tank exploded like a bomb, releasing all its compressed air at once. The creature's eye burst in a spray of fluid that burned like acid. It let me go, writhing in pain, and I kicked hard for the surface. I broke through, just as the rescue swimmer from the helicopter hit the water. He grabbed me under the arms and signaled for the winch. As we rose into the air, I looked down and saw the creature's massive form retreating into the deep, leaving a trail of acidic blood behind. But even wounded, even beaten, I could feel its eyes on me. This wasn't over. It knew where I lived, knew who I was, and it was very, very angry. The Coast Guard medic checked me over as we flew back to base. What happened out there? Your boat's gone, and the water's full of some kind of chemical we've never seen before. I looked out the window at the gray water below, knowing the creature was down there somewhere, planning its revenge. Equipment malfunction, I said. Sometimes things go wrong in deep water. He didn't believe me, but it didn't matter. No one would believe the truth anyway. As we landed at the base, I was already planning my next move. This creature had killed 3 good men, and now it was targeting me. But I knew its weaknesses now, knew how it thought and moved. One way or another, this was going to end tonight. Back at the Coast Guard station, I cleaned up and filed my report. Equipment malfunction, sudden weather change, boat lost to high seas. The same lies I'd told after my Navy incident, the same cover-up that let dangerous things stay hidden in the deep. But Captain Rodriguez wasn't buying it. Lisa, I've seen your service record. You don't lose boats to equipment failure. What really happened out there? I was about to give him another lie when the radio crackled to life. Coast Guard Ketchikan, this is fishing vessel times Mary Catherine asterisk. We're under attack. Something's got hold of our boat. Rodriguez grabbed the microphone. Asterisk, Mary Catherine, asterisk. This is Coast Guard Ketchikan. State your position. Oh God, it's huge. It's pulling us under. We're 3 miles southeast of the radio. Went silent. I knew exactly where they were. The same area where I'd fought the creature, where I'd wounded it with the explosion. It was hunting again, but this time it was angry. We need to scramble a rescue team, Rodriguez said, reaching for the phone. No. I grabbed his arm. You'll just be sending more people to die. That thing down there isn't natural. It's not something you can fight with boats and helicopters. What are you talking about? I made a decision that probably ended my career. 8 years ago, I was on a classified Navy dive team. We encountered something similar in the Pacific. The government covered it up, made us all sign papers, but I know what these things are. and I know how to stop them. Rodriguez stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You're telling me there's some kind of sea monster? I'm telling you that there are things in the deep ocean that science doesn't know about. Things that have been there since before humans existed. And one of them is killing people in my jurisdiction. The radio crackled again. Another voice, different boat. Coast Guard, this is Times Lucky Strike asterisk. The Times Mary Catherine Times just went under. We can see tentacles in the water, big ones. We're getting out of here. Rodriguez looked at me, then at the radio, then back at me. What do you need? I was already suiting up again, grabbing fresh tanks and checking my emergency gear. A fast boat and someone who can drop depth charges. This thing lives deep, but it comes to the surface to hunt. If we can time it right, we can catch it in shallow water where it's vulnerable. Depth charges? We don't have. You've got emergency demolition gear for ice breaking. Same principle, bigger boom. 20 minutes later, we were racing back toward the killing ground in the Coast Guard's fastest patrol boat. Rodriguez was at the helm while I worked with the demolition charges. Military-grade plastic explosive, enough to punch a hole through a battleship's hull. The water where I'd fought the creature was still stained with its acidic blood. Dead fish floated on the surface, their bodies dissolved by the chemical traces in the water. The creature was definitely wounded, but it was still active. Contact, Rodriguez called out. Sonar's picking up something massive, maybe 300 feet down and rising fast. I armed the first depth charge and set the timer for 30 seconds. When I drop this, gun the engine. We need to be a quarter-mile away when it goes off. The creature's head broke the surface 200 yards away, followed by tentacles that writhed like angry snakes. Even wounded, it was magnificent and terrible, a living piece of the ocean's prehistoric past. It saw our boat and began swimming toward us with frightening speed. Water foamed around its massive body as it powered through the waves, and I could see the intelligence in its alien eyes. It remembered me. It wanted revenge. Now, I dropped the first charge and Rodriguez hit the throttle. The patrol boat leaped forward, racing away from the rising creature. The explosion lit up the water like a small sun. The creature's scream echoed across the fjord, a sound of pain and rage that seemed to come from the earth itself. But when the foam cleared, it was still there, still moving, still hunting. It's not enough, I said, arming the second charge. We need to get closer, hit it directly. That thing will tear the boat apart. Not if we time it right. When it dives, it has to surface again to breathe. That's when we hit it. The creature disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only ripples on the surface. I watched the sonar screen, tracking its massive form as it circled below us like a shark. There! The sonar showed it rising fast, coming up directly beneath our boat. Cut the engine. Rodriguez killed the motor just as the creature's tentacles broke the surface around us. They rose like pillars from the deep, each one thicker than a telephone pole and covered with suckers the size of dinner plates. One tentacle wrapped around the boat's bow, another around the stern. The creature was trying to break us in half, but that put it exactly where I needed it to be. I armed the second charge and jumped over the side, swimming directly toward the creature's massive head. Its eyes focused on me with what looked like satisfaction. It thought I was giving up, offering myself as food. Instead, I jammed the charge against the soft flesh behind one of its eyes and kicked away as hard as I could. The creature realized what was happening and tried to dive, but it was too late. The explosion tore through the creature's head like thunder. Brain matter and acidic blood sprayed across the water in a toxic fountain. The massive body convulsed once, twice, then went limp. For a moment, everything was quiet, except for the lapping of waves against our damaged boat. Then the creature's body began to sink, disappearing back into the depths where it had lived for millions of years. I treaded water next to the boat, watching bubbles rise from the deep as the creature settled into its final resting place. Rodriguez pulled me back aboard, his face white with shock. "Is it over?" he asked. I looked at the spreading stain of acidic blood, at the dead fish floating on the surface, at the sonar screen that now showed only empty water below us. "Yeah," I said, "it's over." But, even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. Things like this didn't usually travel alone. Somewhere in the deep ocean, there might be others, waiting in trenches so deep that sunlight had never touched them. For now, though, the waters of the inside passage were safe again. 3 good men had died, but no one else would disappear into the depths. At least not here. Not from this creature. As we limped back to port in our damaged boat, I thought about the Navy papers I'd signed 8 years ago, the promises to never speak about what lived in the deep places of the earth. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep, especially when they started killing innocent people. Maybe it was time to break my silence. The official report listed the incident as an underwater volcanic vent explosion, natural gas buildup, sudden release, tragic loss of fishing vessel times Mary, Catherine times with all hands. The Coast Guard investigators found chemical residue in the water that they couldn't identify, but they filed it under geological phenomenon and moved on. I didn't argue with the cover story. After 23 years of government service, I knew how these things worked. The truth was too strange for most people to handle, and too dangerous for the government to acknowledge. But Captain Rodriguez knew better. 3 days after the incident, he came to my cabin with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of classified files. "I did some digging," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Cross-referenced your story with some reports that officially don't exist. Turns out the Navy's been tracking incidents like this for decades. Missing submarines, lost research vessels, fishing boats that vanish in deep water. Always the same pattern: massive damage from below, chemical traces in the water, and complete official denial." I took a sip of whiskey, feeling it burn away the taste of seawater that I couldn't seem to get out of my mouth. "How many incidents?" 17. "Confirmed, maybe twice that many covered up or attributed to other causes. All in deep ocean areas, all involving massive unidentified biological entities." He slid a file across the table. "This one's from 1987. A research submarine investigating thermal vents in the Mariana Trench. They lost contact at 20,000 feet. When they finally found the wreckage, it looked like it had been crushed by something with tentacles." I opened the file and immediately recognized the damage patterns. Circular sucker marks on the hull, chemical scoring from digestive acids, crew compartments torn open with surgical precision. It was the same creature I'd encountered, or something very much like it. "The government's been tracking these things for decades," Rodriguez continued. "But they can't admit they exist because it would cause mass panic. Imagine if people knew there were predators the size of city blocks living in the ocean. So they just let them kill people? They contain what they can, cover up what they can't, and hope the problem stays in deep water where most people never go." He poured himself another drink. "But climate change is pushing these things into shallower water. Warming oceans, changing currents, pollution in their normal habitat. They're being forced to hunt in areas where people actually live and work." I thought about the creature's final moments, the intelligence in its eyes as it died. It hadn't been evil, just desperate and alone. The last of its kind, trying to survive in a world that had changed beyond recognition. "What happens now?" I asked. "Officially? Nothing. You file your report, I file mine, and this incident gets buried in a classified vault somewhere. But unofficially." He leaned forward. "The Navy's putting together a new research team. People who've had direct contact with these entities, who understand what they're dealing with. They want you to consult." I looked out the window, at the calm water of the harbor, knowing that somewhere beneath those peaceful waves, other things were stirring. The creature I'd killed might have been alone, but there were others out there. The deep ocean was vast and largely unexplored, full of trenches and caverns where ancient things could hide. "I'm retired from government service," I said finally. "I know, but 3 fishing boats have gone missing near the Aleutian Islands in the past month. Same pattern, same chemical traces. Whatever you killed here, it wasn't the only one." I finished my whiskey and stood up, my body still aching from the fight in the deep water. Outside, a fishing boat was heading out for the evening catch, its crew laughing and joking as they prepared their nets. They had no idea what was waiting in the depths below their hulls. "If I do this," I said, "I do it my way. No more cover-ups, no more lies. People have a right to know what's out there." Rodriguez nodded. "The world's changing, Lisa. Climate change, deep sea, mining, ocean exploration. We're disturbing places that have been untouched for millions of years. The things that live down there won't stay hidden much longer. He left me the classified files and his card, along with a secure phone number for the Navy Research Division. I spent the rest of the night reading reports of encounters with things that shouldn't exist, patterns of disappearances that went back to the early days of deep-sea exploration. The creature I'd fought was just the beginning. There were others down there, sleeping in trenches so deep that the pressure would crush a human instantly, feeding in underwater canyons where the geology itself was alien. Some of them were probably peaceful, just trying to live their ancient lives in the changing ocean. But others were hunting. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a marine biologist in Oregon. Whale carcasses washing ashore with massive bite marks, fishing nets coming up empty in areas that should be rich with life, sonar contacts that didn't match any known species. The same signs I'd learned to recognize in Alaska. I packed my diving gear and caught the next flight south. The world needed to know what was rising from the depths, and I was one of the few people alive who could tell them. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but not forever. Climate change was forcing those secrets to the surface, and humanity needed to be ready for what was coming, because in the deep places of the earth, ancient things were stirring, and some of them were very, very hungry. My name is Michael Stormcrow, and I've been hunting poachers for 11 years. Not the kind of hunting most people think about. I'm a federal wildlife ranger, and my job is to catch the criminals who kill protected animals for money. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in June 1986. I was sitting in my small office in Fairbanks, looking at reports and drinking terrible coffee when my radio crackled to life. "Stormcrow, you there?" It was my supervisor, Jim Martinez. "Yeah, Jim, what's up?" "Got a situation in the Arctic refuge. Bush pilot found 4 bodies at an old airstrip near the coastal plain. Looks like poachers, but something's not right." I set down my coffee cup. 4 bodies meant this was serious. What kind of not right? "State troopers can't get there until tomorrow because of weather. Need you to fly out and secure the scene. Pilot says it looks like the poachers killed each other, but..." Jim paused. "Well, you'll see." An hour later, I was in a small plane flying north over endless green tundra. The pilot, a weathered guy named Pete, kept glancing at me in the mirror. "You ever been to the calving grounds this time of year?" he asked. "A few times. Why?" "Caribou should be everywhere right now. Thousands of them, but I haven't seen a single one today." He shook his head. "Been flying this route for 20 years. Never seen anything like it." I looked out the window at the empty landscape. Pete was right. During calving season, you usually couldn't fly over this area without seeing huge herds of caribou. But today, the tundra stretched out below us, completely empty. The airstrip was just a flat piece of ground with an old wooden building beside it. When we landed, I could see a small plane parked nearby and several dark shapes on the ground. "You want me to wait?" Pete asked as I grabbed my gear. "Yeah, this shouldn't take too long." But I was wrong about that. The first body was maybe 50 feet from the plane. It was a man in his 40s, wearing expensive hunting clothes. His rifle lay nearby, still loaded. What got my attention wasn't the fact that he was dead, it was how he died. Something had torn his chest open with claws, big claws. The cuts were too clean to be from a knife, too precise to be from a bear. And they were arranged in a pattern, like someone, or something, had taken their time. The second body was worse. This one had been dragged about 100 yards from the plane and hung upside down from a metal post. His throat was cut, and all the blood had drained into the ground below. It reminded me of how hunters dress deer. Except this was a person. My war injuries were acting up. My left leg always got stiff when I was tense. But I kept walking. The third and fourth bodies were near the old building. One had been torn apart so badly I could barely tell it was human. The other was sitting upright against the wall, his eyes missing, his mouth stuffed full of caribou hair. I'd seen plenty of death in Vietnam, and plenty more in 11 years of ranger work. But this was different. This felt personal. Angry. I radioed back to Jim. 4 confirmed dead. Adult males, probably poachers, based on equipment. But Jim, this wasn't humans who did this. What do you mean? I mean, whatever killed these guys wasn't human. The wounds are wrong. The positioning is wrong. Everything about this is wrong. There was a long pause. Just document everything, Mike. State troopers will sort it out when they get there. I spent the next 2 hours taking pictures and making notes. The poachers had killed at least a dozen caribou. I found the carcasses piled up behind the building, their antlers cut off, the meat left to rot. Thousands of dollars worth of antlers, just sitting there. But what bothered me most were the tracks. They started at the edge of the airstrip and followed a straight line to each body. They weren't bear tracks. I knew bear tracks. These were bigger, deeper, and shaped like human footprints, except with long claw marks at the end of each toe. Whatever made these tracks had walked upright, on 2 legs, and it was big. Maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, judging by the stride length. I was measuring the tracks when I heard Pete calling from the plane. "Stormcrow, we need to go. Weather's moving in." I looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, moving fast. In Alaska, you don't mess around with weather, but as I walked back to the plane, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. "See anything interesting?" Pete asked as I climbed into the plane. "Yeah," I said, still looking around. "Too interesting." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those tracks, about the way the bodies were arranged. In Vietnam, I'd learned to trust my gut when something felt wrong. And everything about this felt wrong. The next morning, Jim called me into his office. State Trooper Sergeant Hall was there, along with an FBI agent named Cooper. "Stormcrow," Jim said. "Tell them what you found." I went through my report, showing them the pictures. Sergeant Hall whistled when he saw the crime scene photos. "Looks like they had a falling out," Hall said, "probably arguing over money. These poaching operations, somebody always gets greedy." Agent Cooper nodded. "We see this a lot with organized crime. When there's big money involved, trust breaks down fast." I shook my head. "No, you don't understand. Humans didn't do this. Look at the wounds. Look at the tracks." Cooper glanced at the track photos. Could be bear prints. Or maybe they used some kind of tool to make it look like an animal attack. "I've been tracking for 20 years, I said. "These aren't bear prints, and no tool made those wounds." "So what are you saying?" Hall asked. "Some kind of monster killed 4 poachers?" When he put it like that, it sounded crazy. But I knew what I'd seen. "I'm saying we need to investigate more before we close this case." Jim leaned back in his chair. "Mike, you're due to retire in 6 months. Medical retirement because of your leg and other issues. Don't make this complicated." The other issues he was talking about were the nightmares, the paranoia, all the stuff that came back from the war. The department shrink said I had something called PTSD. All I knew was that sometimes I saw enemies where there weren't any. Maybe that's what was happening now. "Fine," I said, "but I want to go back out there. Look around some more." "Why?" Cooper asked. "Because this is caribou calving season. Those animals are worth millions to the local tribes and to the ecosystem. If there's still a poaching operation running, I need to shut it down." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that something about those tracks wouldn't leave me alone. 2 days later, I flew back to the coastal plain with Pete. This time, we brought camping gear. I wanted to spend a few days in the area, see if I could find any sign of other poachers. "You sure about this?" Pete asked as he unloaded my gear. "Weather forecast isn't good. I'll be fine. Pick me up in 3 days." After Pete left, the silence was overwhelming. In June, this far north, the sun never really sets. It just circles around the sky, casting long shadows that shift and move all day. It should have been peaceful, but instead it felt like being watched. I set up camp near the airstrip and started exploring. The caribou herds were still nowhere to be seen. In fact, I didn't see any animals at all. No birds, no ground squirrels, nothing. It was like the whole area was empty of life. On my first night, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It started around midnight, a sound like caribou calling, but wrong somehow. Higher pitched, more urgent. It was coming through my radio. I checked the frequency. I was on the emergency channel, the one all aircraft and rangers monitored, but the sound wasn't coming from any aircraft. "Hello?" "This is Ranger Stormcrow. Is anyone out there?" The caribou calls stopped. Then, after a long pause, I heard a man's voice. "Help, please help. Who is this? What's your location?" "They're hunting us. It's hunting us. Oh God, it's here." The voice cut off with a scream. Then the caribou calls started again. I tried calling back, but got no response. I radioed Jim, but couldn't reach him either. Too far north, probably. The next morning, I found new tracks around my campsite. The same tracks I'd seen at the crime scene. They circled my tent 3 times, then led off toward the north. Whatever made them had been watching me while I slept. That's when I started to get scared. I followed the tracks for about 2 miles before I found what I was looking for. Another camp, hidden in a small valley. Or what was left of one. 3 tents, all torn to pieces. Camping gear scattered everywhere. And in the middle of it all, 2 more bodies. These ones were fresh, killed maybe the night before. One was hanging from a makeshift flagpole, upside down, just like the poacher at the airstrip. The other was sitting by the cold fire pit, his hands positioned like he was warming them over flames that weren't there. Both men had expensive gear, professional hunting equipment, more poachers. I searched their camp and found something that made me sit down hard on a rock. A radio, tuned to the emergency frequency, the same frequency where I'd heard the voice calling for help. These were the men I'd heard dying. And that meant whatever killed them was still out here, still hunting. I should have called for extraction right then. Should have radioed Pete and gotten out of there. But something kept me from doing it. Maybe it was the cop in me. I'd never walked away from a case. Maybe it was the soldier in me. I'd never retreated from a fight. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe I knew, deep down, that running wouldn't help. That whatever was out here wouldn't stop until it was finished. I spent the rest of that day documenting the new crime scene. The pattern was the same: precise wounds, ritualistic positioning, those massive clawed tracks everywhere. But there was something new this time. Carved into a tree near the camp, about 8 feet off the ground, was a symbol. It looked like antlers, but wrong somehow. Too many branches, too geometric. And it was fresh. The sap was still bleeding from the cuts. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my rifle across my lap, listening to the radio crackle with those strange caribou calls. Sometimes I thought I could hear voices mixed in with the animal sounds. Voices calling for help, calling for mercy. Voices of the dead. Around 3 a.m., my tent started shaking. Not from wind. There was no wind. Something was brushing against the outside, walking around and around. I could hear breathing, heavy and rhythmic, and something that sounded like antlers scraping against each other. I wanted to look outside, but every instinct I had told me not to. Whatever was out there, it wanted me to look. It was testing me, seeing how brave I was, or how stupid. The circling went on for an hour. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I waited until dawn before I unzipped my tent. The tracks were everywhere, dozens of them, overlapping, spiraling out from my campsite in all directions. And there was something else: gifts. Arranged in a neat line in front of my tent were 6 caribou antlers. Beautiful ones, perfect specimens, the kind of antlers that poachers would kill for. But these hadn't been cut off, they'd been shed. Naturally, gathered from somewhere else, and brought here. It was like an offering, or a warning. I packed up my gear and started hiking toward the pickup point. Pete wasn't supposed to come for another day, but I figured I could signal him early if I could get to higher ground. I made it about 5 miles before I found the trail. It was worn into the ground like an old game trail, but wrong. Too wide for caribou, too straight. It ran north-south across the tundra, and it was marked with those same antler symbols carved into rocks and trees. I followed it north for maybe an hour before I realized where it was leading. The trail ended at an old oil exploration site, just a few abandoned buildings and some rusted equipment. But someone had been using it recently. The buildings were full of supplies, food, camping gear, weapons, enough for a dozen men, and in the largest building, hanging from the ceiling, were hundreds of caribou antlers. This wasn't just a poaching operation. This was industrial-scale slaughter. They'd been killing the caribou by the hundreds, taking only the antlers, leaving the meat to rot. No wonder the herds had abandoned the area. But the poachers were all dead now, every single one of them. I found their vehicles parked behind the main building. 3 trucks and 2 ATVs. The keys were still in them, but when I tried to start one, nothing happened. The engines had been torn apart, metal pieces scattered like confetti. Something didn't want anyone leaving. I was examining the destroyed engines when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy footsteps, too heavy to be human. I turned around slowly, my hand on my rifle. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Because what was standing at the edge of the camp couldn't be real. It looked like a man, but huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9, massively built, with muscles, like a bodybuilder. But instead of a human head, it had the head of a caribou. A massive rack of antlers spread out from its skull, and its eyes glowed with a soft, steady light. It was watching me, just standing there, perfectly still, watching. I raised my rifle. "Stay back." The creature tilted its head, and I heard something that chilled me to the bone. It was laughing. Not like a human laughs, but like wind through trees, like water over rocks, ancient and cold and utterly without mercy. Then it spoke. "You failed them." Its voice was deep, echoing, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You swore to protect them, and you failed. I don't know what you're talking about. The sacred herds, my children, you were their guardian, and you let the killers come." I thought about all the reports I'd filed over the years, all the poaching operations I'd investigated. How many had I stopped? How many had gotten away while I was buried in paperwork or chasing false leads? Too many. "I did my job," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Your job." The creature stepped closer. "Your job was to protect. Instead, you counted bodies and wrote reports. While my children died, it was right, and I knew it. For 11 years, I'd been fighting a war I couldn't win. For every poacher I caught, 10 more took his place. For every operation I shut down, 2 more started up. I was just one man against an industry. "What do you want?" I asked. The creature smiled, showing teeth like broken glass. "Justice." That's when I understood. This wasn't random. The creature hadn't just stumbled across the poaching operation. It had been hunting them, specifically, methodically. And it had been watching me the whole time, judging me. "You're some kind of spirit," I said, "connected to the caribou. I am their guardian, their avenger. As you were supposed to be." The creature began walking toward me, its massive hooves leaving those familiar tracks in the soft ground. I backed up, my rifle still aimed at its chest, but my hands were shaking. "I tried," I said. "I've been trying for 11 years. Trying is not enough. They trusted you, and you failed them." Images flashed through my mind. All the cases that got away, all the poachers who disappeared before I could arrest them, all the animals who died while I was following proper procedure and waiting for backup. The creature was close now, maybe 20 feet away. I could smell it, like pine trees and snow and something wild and ancient. Its eyes were fixed on mine, and I felt like it could see right through me, see every failure, every compromise, every time I'd chosen safety over action. "I'm retiring in 6 months," I said desperately. "Medical retirement. I'm done with all this." "You are done when I say you are done." The creature reached out one massive hand, claws extended. I pulled the trigger. The rifle boomed across the beast, empty landscape. The bullet hit the creature square in the chest, and I saw it jerk backward. For a moment, I thought I'd won. Then the creature looked down at its chest, where there was no wound, no blood. The bullet had passed right through it, like it was made of mist. It looked back up at me and smiled again. My turn. The creature grabbed my rifle and crushed it like it was made of paper. Then it picked me up by the front of my jacket and lifted me off the ground. "You failed them," it said, its face inches from mine. "And now you will pay." I was going to die. I knew it, just like the poachers, just like all the others who had come here with blood on their hands. But then something happened that I didn't expect. I stopped being afraid. Maybe it was the soldier in me, the part that had learned to accept death in Vietnam. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But suddenly, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. "You're right," I said. "I failed them. I failed them because the system is broken. Because I'm one man against an industry that makes millions off killing animals. Because I have to follow rules, while the poachers don't. The creature's grip loosened slightly. But I never stopped trying, I continued. Even when my leg was screaming with pain, even when the nightmares kept me awake, even when everyone told me to just count the days until retirement, I never stopped hunting them. And what did your hunting accomplish? Not enough, but something. I caught over 200 poachers in 11 years. I shut down dozens of operations. I saved thousands of animals. The creature set me down but didn't step back. Not enough. No, I agreed, not enough. But it was what I could do. One man, following the rules, working within a system that's designed to fail. Then the system must change. I looked into those glowing eyes and saw something I hadn't expected. Pain. This creature wasn't just angry, it was grieving. It had watched its children, the caribou it protected, die by the hundreds, while people like me filled out forms and waited for backup. What do you want from me? I asked again. Justice. I can't give you justice. I'm retiring. I'm broken. I gestured to my leg, to my whole body. I'm used up. Then you will be remade. The creature pressed one massive hand against my chest. I felt heat, incredible heat, flowing into me. Not burning heat, but something else. Something that felt like strength, like purpose. You will be my agent, the creature said. You will hunt them as I hunt them, without mercy, without compromise, without the rules that tie your hands. The heat was spreading through my whole body now. I could feel my old war wounds healing, my damaged leg becoming strong again. But more than that, I could feel something else changing. Something in my mind, in my heart. The creature was right. The rules, the procedures, the proper channels, they were all just excuses. Ways to avoid doing what needed to be done. What happens if I say no? I asked. The creature smiled one last time. You won't. And I knew it was right. The heat faded, and the creature stepped back. When I looked at my hands, there were new scars on my palms. The same antler symbol that had been carved into the trees. Find them, the creature said. Hunt them, show them the same mercy they showed my children. And if I do this, if I become your agent, what happens to me? You become what you were always meant to be. The creature began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. But its voice remained, echoing across the empty tundra. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Then I was alone. Pete found me 3 days later, walking south along the old trail. I told him I'd gotten lost, that my radio had been damaged in a fall. He seemed to buy it. The official report listed the 6 dead poachers as victims of a gang dispute. Agent Cooper wrote that they'd turned on each other over money, using knives and axes in their final fight. The strange wounds were explained as the result of crude weapons and animals scavenging the bodies after death. The case was closed within a week. But I wasn't done. My medical retirement was processed on schedule, but instead of staying in Fairbanks, I moved to a small cabin north of the Arctic Circle. Officially, I was a private wildlife consultant. Unofficially, I had become something else. The creature had changed me. I could feel it every day, in my healed leg, in my enhanced senses, in the way I could track anything across any terrain. But most of all, I could feel it in my purpose. Within a month of moving to my cabin, I found my first target, a man named Davidson who ran a smuggling operation out of Deadhorse. He specialized in polar bear parts, gallbladders, claws, fur, all illegal, all highly profitable. I found him in a bar, bragging about a recent kill. A mother bear with 2 cubs. He'd killed all 3, sold the parts to buyers in Asia, made enough money to buy a new truck. I followed him home that night. They found his body the next morning, hanging upside down from a light pole behind his house. The official cause of death was listed as a mugging gone wrong. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no leads. But carved into his front door was a simple symbol, antlers. Word spread fast in the small community of poachers and smugglers. Someone was hunting them. Someone who knew their methods, their routes, their contacts. Someone who could track them anywhere and strike without warning. Some of them tried to leave Alaska. Those ones usually had accidents on their way out. Car crashes on remote highways. Drownings in rivers they'd crossed 100 times before. Heart attacks in men who'd never had heart problems. Others tried to go legitimate. getting jobs with oil companies or fishing boats. Those ones lived, as long as they stayed legitimate. But the ones who kept hunting, who kept killing, they kept dying. Within 2 years, poaching in northern Alaska had dropped to almost nothing. Game wardens reported success rates they'd never seen before. Wildlife populations began to recover, and the caribou came back. Every spring now, they returned to the coastal plain for calving season. Thousands of them, flowing across the tundra like a brown river. Sometimes I watch them from my cabin windows, and I think I can see a familiar figure moving among them. Tall, antlered, eternal. Watching over his children, I still hunt poachers. Not officially, there's no badge, no authority, no backup, but I hunt them. And when I find them, I remember what the creature taught me about justice. Justice delayed is not justice denied. And sometimes, late at night when the radio crackles with strange sounds, I hear voices. Voices of the ones who tried to run, tried to hide, tried to keep killing what shouldn't be killed. They're still calling for help, but there's no help coming. Because now I am the thing that hunts in the darkness. Now I am the guardian of creatures who can't protect themselves. And I will never stop. Never.